The horn sounded 3 times, before the sun had even cleared the hills, and every person in Millhaven knew what that meant. Soldiers were coming down the North Road, and they were not coming for trade. Clara Bennett stood at the window of her father's old workshop, watching riders kick up dust between the pines. She counted them without meaning to. 6 on horseback, 1 wagon behind, banners the color of dried blood snapping in the wind. She had heard stories about those banners since she was a child. They belonged to Gareth Voss, the man the whole region called the Wolf King, and men who rode under his banner did not visit villages to admire the scenery. By the time the riders reached the square, half of Millhaven had gathered, and none of them looked ready for what was coming. Clara pushed through the crowd until she stood near the front, close enough to hear the lead rider speak to Edmund Price, the village elder. 3 seasons, the rider said, his voice flat and used to being obeyed. 3 seasons of unpaid tribute. The king has been patient. His patience is now finished. Edmund's hands trembled, though he tried to hide it behind his sleeves. We have grain, he said. We have wool, tools, whatever the king requires. Give us until the harvest and we will. The king does not want grain, the rider interrupted. Not this time. A silence fell over the square, thick enough to feel on the skin. Clara watched the rider's eyes move slowly across the crowd, the way a man studies cattle before choosing which one to take. He wants a person, the rider said. 1 woman, given freely, to settle the debt in full. Refuse, and we return with more than 6 riders. The crowd erupted into whispers, then arguments, then something close to panic. Mothers pulled their daughters back into doorways. Fathers stepped in front of wives. Clara stood still in the middle of it all, feeling something strange settle over her. Not fear exactly, but a sharp and sudden clarity, as if a door she had been waiting to open had finally creaked apart. She had spent years training herself to notice details other people missed. Her father had taught her that, before he disappeared under circumstances no one in the village would speak of. He had taught her to read a room the way a locksmith reads a lock, searching for the one weak point that made everything else fall into place. And right now, watching Edmund Price stammer excuses to a man who clearly did not care, Clara understood something the rest of the village did not. The Wolf King was not simply demanding tribute, he was demanding a hostage. And a hostage, if chosen carefully, could be more than a prisoner. A hostage could be a way inside. For years, Clara had wondered how she might ever get close enough to the fortress called Ravenspire to find answers about her father's disappearance. She had heard the rumors, the same as everyone, that he had once served a lord who fell out of favor with the crown, and that when the lord's secrets were exposed, so was every person connected to him. Her father had vanished not long after. No trial, no explanation. Just silence, and a family left to rebuild itself from nothing. Now here was a door, opening on its own, right in front of her. I will go, Clara said. The words came out steady, louder than she intended, and the entire square turned toward her. Edmund Price's mouth fell open. The rider on horseback studied her with new interest, the way a merchant studies an unexpected discount. Clara, no. Lucy Marsh, her closest friend since childhood, grabbed her arm hard enough to hurt. You don't know what happens to people who go to that place. Neither do you, Clara said quietly, which means neither of us can say it will be as bad as you're imagining. It was a lie, gentle enough to be forgivable. Clara knew exactly what kind of reputation the Wolf King carried, the same as everyone else in the region did. Ravenspire was spoken of as a place where enemies vanished, and loyalty was purchased with fear rather than trust. But fear was a tool, not a fact, and Clara had learned long ago that reputations were often built to keep curious people away from the truth. Edmund Price approached her, his voice low. You don't have to do this. There may be another way. There isn't, Clara said, and she meant it, though not for the reason he assumed. The village needs the debt settled before winter. I have no husband, no children who depend on me. It should be me. It was a reasonable argument, one that satisfied the elder and quieted most of the whispering in the crowd. It was also, conveniently, exactly what Clara wanted them to believe. The lead rider dismounted, boots striking the packed dirt of the square, with a sound that seemed to end all further discussion. He walked toward Clara slowly, studying her face, her posture, the calm way she held herself while half the village around her wept or argued. You understand what you are agreeing to, he said. It was not a question. I understand that Millhaven owes a debt. and I am able to pay it," Clara answered. The rider's eyes narrowed slightly. Most people offered up as tribute cried, begged, or fainted before the horses even turned around. This woman looked at him as if she were negotiating the price of bread. "What is your name?" he asked. "Clara Bennett. I am Roland Blake, lieutenant to the king." He gestured toward the wagon. "You will ride with us. We leave within the hour." An hour. Clara had imagined she would have a night to prepare, to gather her thoughts, perhaps to visit her father's old workshop one final time, and search once more through the drawers she had already searched 100 times before. Instead, she had 60 minutes to say goodbye to the only home she had ever known. Lucy followed her back to the small house at the edge of the village, tears streaming freely now that the crowd had dispersed. "You're not doing this for the village," Lucy said, her voice cracking. "I've known you since we were children. I know when you're hiding something." Clara folded a spare set of clothes into a bag, keeping her hands steady, even as her friend's words landed close to the truth. "I'm doing this because someone has to, and I am the one with the least to lose." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I can give you right now." Clara paused, looking at Lucy properly for the first time since the horn sounded. "If anything happens to me, look in my father's workshop. Behind the loose board under the window, there's something there I want you to have." Lucy's eyes widened. "Clara, what is going on?" "I don't fully know yet," Clara admitted, and that much at least was true. "But I intend to find out." When the hour ended, Clara walked to the wagon without looking back at the crowd that had gathered to watch her leave. She climbed in beside 2 other soldiers who eyed her the way men eye something they do not yet understand, and Roland Blake mounted his horse at the front of the small procession. As the wagon began to move, the village of Millhaven shrank behind her, the rooftops and smoke and familiar faces disappearing into a haze of dust, kicked up by hooves and wheels. Clara did not cry. She did not tremble. Instead, she reached into the folds of her sleeve and touched the small object she had hidden there, before leaving the house. A fragment of a coded letter her father had left behind years ago, one she had never been able to fully decipher. Perhaps, inside the walls of Ravenspire, she finally would. The road north grew steadily colder, the trees thickening into dense forest that blocked out most of the afternoon light. Roland Blake rode ahead in silence, occasionally exchanging clipped words with the other soldiers, but none of them spoke directly to Clara. She used the silence to her advantage, watching everything. The way the soldiers checked their weapons at certain points along the road, as if expecting trouble from specific locations. The subtle tension that crossed Roland's face whenever they passed markers carved into certain trees. The careful spacing between riders that suggested a formation built from habit, perhaps from surviving ambushes before. None of it was obvious to someone who was not looking for it, but Clara had spent her entire life looking. By the time the sun began sinking behind the hills, the wagon reached a narrow pass between 2 rocky slopes, the kind of terrain that made even the soldiers grow quiet and alert. Clara noticed Roland's hand drift toward the hilt of his sword, though his eyes remained forward. "Something wrong, Lieutenant?" she asked, keeping her tone light, curious rather than afraid. Roland glanced back at her, surprised she had spoken at all. "This pass has seen trouble before. Bandits, mostly. Sometimes worse. Worse than bandits. Spies," he said simply, and turned back around, as if he had already said more than he intended. Clara filed the word away carefully. Spies meant rivals. Rivals meant the Wolf King had enemies willing to send people into his territory unnoticed, which meant the fortress she was being taken to was not nearly as secure or as feared as its reputation suggested. It was, instead, a place under quiet pressure from forces working in the shadows. Forces Clara suspected might already know things about her father that she herself did not. The pass narrowed further, the wagon wheels grinding against loose stone, and for a moment, complete silence settled over the group. Then, somewhere above them on the rocky slope, a single stone shifted and rolled downward, clattering against the path ahead of the lead horse. Every soldier froze. Roland's sword was half drawn before the sound even finished echoing. "Show yourself," he called out, his voice sharp and commanding, cutting through the stillness of the pass. "Now." Nothing answered but wind moving through the pines above them, and the distant, patient sound of something moving carefully out of sight. Roland raised a hand, signaling the other soldiers to spread wide across the narrow path. Clara stayed low in the wagon, but she did not look away from the slope. Her eyes traced the shadows between the rocks, searching for the small details that mattered, the shape that did not match the stone around it, the branch that swayed against the direction of the wind. There, a flicker of movement near a cluster of boulders, gone before anyone else seemed to notice it. There, Clara said quietly, pointing toward the spot without drawing attention to herself. Near the boulders, second from the left. Roland's eyes snapped toward where she indicated, and one of the other soldiers immediately moved in that direction, sword drawn. For a tense moment, nothing happened. Then a figure broke from cover, sprinting along the ridge with practiced speed, cloak flattened against the wind. Roland shouted an order, and two soldiers gave chase up the slope, though it was clear from the distance already gained that they would not catch whoever it was. The figure vanished over the ridge, leaving only silence behind. Roland turned back toward Clara, his expression unreadable. "How did you see that before my own men did?" Clara shrugged, careful to keep her voice light. "I grew up watching for wolves near the sheep pens. You learn to notice small things, or the flock pays for it." It was a convincing answer, ordinary enough that Roland seemed to accept it, though something in his gaze lingered a moment longer than necessary, as if he were recalculating something about the woman sitting quietly in his wagon. The soldiers returned from the ridge empty-handed, reporting no further sign of the intruder. Roland ordered the group to continue moving, faster now, and the wagon lurched forward through the remainder of the pass without further incident. But the tension did not fully leave the air. Clara noticed the way the soldiers kept glancing toward the ridgeline for the rest of the journey, the way Roland's jaw remained tight, the way none of them relaxed even after the terrain opened back into wider, safer ground. Someone had been watching them. Someone skilled enough to disappear before capture, patient enough to wait in cold rock for however long it took the wagon to arrive. That kind of patience was not the mark of a common bandit. It was the mark of someone sent with purpose, someone gathering information rather than seeking easy plunder. Clara thought of her father again, of the coded fragment hidden in her sleeve, of the quiet years spent wondering what exactly he had known before he vanished. If spies were already moving through the shadows near Ravenspire, then whatever secret her father had carried might still matter to people far beyond one small village and one grieving daughter. As dusk settled fully over the road, the outline of a distant fortress finally became visible against the darkening sky, its towers jagged and black, rising from the hills like something carved rather than built. Torches burned along its walls, small orange points scattered across the stone like watchful eyes. Ravenspire. Clara felt her pulse quicken, though her face remained calm. Practiced stillness holding steady even as every instinct in her body recognized the weight of what waited ahead. She was being brought into the heart of the very place that might hold answers to questions she had carried for years. She was also, whether the soldiers around her realized it or not, walking directly into the path of forces already circling that fortress from the shadows. Roland glanced back one final time before the wagon began its climb toward the gates. "Whatever you did back there," he said, "keep it to yourself once we're inside. The king does not like surprises." Clara met his eyes and said nothing, though inwardly, she understood a simple truth the lieutenant did not yet grasp. She had not come to Ravenspire to avoid surprising anyone. She had come because she intended to be the biggest surprise the fortress had seen in years. The gates of Ravenspire opened with a groan of iron and old wood, and Clara understood, the moment she passed beneath them, that the fortress had been built to make visitors feel small. Walls rose high on every side, thick enough to swallow sound, and torches lined the inner courtyard in rows, so precise they seemed less like decoration, and more like a warning. Everything here had a purpose. Nothing was accidental. Soldiers moved through the courtyard with quiet efficiency, none of them speaking louder than necessary, none of them meeting her eyes for longer than a glance. Roland Blake dismounted first, then turned to help her down from the wagon, though his grip on her arm was firm rather than gentle, the grip of a man handling something he did not yet trust. "You'll be taken to the West Hall," he said. "The king will decide what to do with you when it suits him. Until then, you speak only when spoken to, and you do not wander." "Understood," Clara said simply, though inside she was already cataloging the layout of the courtyard, the placement of the guard towers, the distance between the outer gate and what appeared to be a second, smaller gate leading toward the stables. A woman approached from a side doorway, dressed in plain gray, her hair tied back tightly. She looked Clara over with an expression that was neither warm nor hostile, simply assessing. "This way," the woman said. "I'm Lucy Marsh." Clara blinked, startled by the coincidence of the name, though she said nothing of it. It seemed strange, almost like an omen, hearing her closest friend's name spoken by a stranger in a place so far from home. She followed the woman through a corridor lined with narrow windows, each one offering a brief glimpse of the fortress beyond. More walls, more towers, more soldiers moving with quiet purpose. "You're the one from Millhaven," Lucy said, not quite a question. "The trade. That's right." "Most people who arrive here like that don't last long in the household," Lucy said, her voice carrying no cruelty, only practical honesty. "They either prove useful quickly, or they're forgotten in some corner of the kitchens, until the king decides what else to do with them." "And which will I be?" Clara asked. Lucy glanced sideways at her, something like curiosity flickering across her face. "That depends on you. Most people who come here try to disappear, to avoid drawing attention, until the king forgets they exist. It's safer that way. And if someone doesn't want to disappear?" Lucy stopped walking for a moment, studying Clara more closely now. "Then they'd better be very good at whatever it is they're trying to prove, because the king does not tolerate wasted attention. He notices everything, and he forgives very little." They reached a small chamber near the western wall, sparse but clean, a narrow bed, and a single window overlooking a courtyard garden below. Lucy gestured for Clara to enter. "Rest tonight. Tomorrow you'll be presented properly." Clara nodded, though sleep felt distant given everything crowding her thoughts. Once alone, she moved to the window, studying the layout of the garden below, the placement of the guards along the walls, the pattern of torchlight that revealed which sections of the fortress remained active, even after dark. It was habit now, the same instinct her father had trained into her since childhood, though for years she had used it only to read the small dramas of village life. Here, in Ravenspire, that same instinct suddenly felt vital in a way it never had before. She reached into her sleeve and withdrew the fragment of coded letter she had carried since leaving Millhaven, unfolding it carefully in the dim light. The symbols were faded, some of the ink smudged beyond recognition, but the pattern remained familiar enough. Her father had used a cipher based on old trade routes, substituting letters for the names of towns along a merchant road he once traveled. She had solved perhaps half the message over the years, enough to know it referenced someone called only the Falcon, and a debt owed that had never been repaid. Whoever the Falcon was, Clara suspected the answer waited somewhere within these walls. Morning arrived with the sound of boots in the corridor, and Lucy's voice calling through the door. "The king wishes to see you. Now, not later." Clara dressed quickly, tucking the fragment of coded letter back into the hidden fold of her sleeve, before following Lucy through winding passageways that led deeper into the fortress. The air grew cooler as they descended toward the main hall, stone replacing wood, the sound of their footsteps echoing louder with each turn. The doors to the great hall stood open when they arrived, revealing a chamber far larger than Clara expected, its ceiling supported by dark wooden beams, banners hanging from the walls bearing the same blood-colored insignia she had seen on the riders back in Millhaven. At the far end, seated upon a chair that was more practical than ornate, sat a man Clara recognized instantly despite never having seen him before. Gareth Voss did not look the way rumor described him. There was no cruelty carved into his face, no obvious madness in his eyes. Instead, he looked tired in a way that suggested years of carrying weight most men would have buckled beneath, his expression unreadable, his posture disciplined, even in stillness. He watched Clara approach with a patience that felt almost unsettling, as if he had already decided something about her before she said a single word. "You're the one from Millhaven," he said, echoing Lucy's earlier words, though his tone carried none of her warmth. "I am," Clara answered. "Most people brought here as tribute either weep or beg or collapse before reaching this hall." His eyes studied her carefully. "You've done none of those things. Would it have changed anything if I had?" A flicker of something crossed his expression, surprise perhaps, or interest, gone before Clara could fully identify it. "No," he admitted, "it would not have. Then I saw no reason to waste the effort." Silence stretched between them, heavy enough that even the guards along the walls seemed to hold their breath. Gareth leaned forward slightly, studying her the way Roland had studied her back on the road, as if trying to solve a puzzle whose pieces did not quite fit the picture he expected. "What is your name?" he asked. "Clara Bennett." "And what skill do you bring with you?" "Clara Bennett." "Every person who enters my household eventually proves useful in some fashion, or they become a burden I cannot afford to keep." Clara considered her answer carefully, aware that whatever she said now would shape how she was treated for however long she remained within these walls. Revealing too much too soon would draw exactly the kind of scrutiny she could not yet survive. Revealing too little would leave her buried in some forgotten corner of the kitchens, exactly where Lucy had warned people like her often ended up. "I notice things," Clara said finally. "Small details other people overlook. It has proven useful before." Gareth's eyes narrowed slightly, though whether from doubt or genuine curiosity, Clara could not yet tell. "That is a vague answer." "It is an honest one," she replied. "Sometimes the most useful skills are the ones that resist easy description." For a long moment, the Wolf King said nothing, simply studying her with the same unreadable patience he had shown since she first entered the hall. Then, finally, he gestured toward Lucy, who stood waiting near the doorway. "Assign her to the archive wing," he said. "Under supervision. If she is as observant as she claims, we will see soon enough whether that observation proves useful, or whether it becomes a problem I must deal with directly." Lucy bowed slightly and gestured for Clara to follow. As they turned to leave the hall, Clara felt the weight of Gareth's gaze following her the entire way, sharp and assessing. The gaze of a man who had survived by trusting almost no one, and who had just decided, for reasons even he likely could not fully explain, that this particular new arrival warranted closer attention than most. Outside the hall, once they were alone in the corridor, Lucy exhaled slowly. "That went better than most first meetings," she said. "He usually decides within minutes whether someone is worth remembering. You've earned yourself at least a few weeks before he forgets you exist." "Only a few weeks?" Clara asked. "Around here," Lucy said, leading her toward a narrow staircase. "A few weeks is longer than most people get." Clara said nothing, though inwardly, she was already calculating how much time she would need. A few weeks might be enough to search the archive wing thoroughly, to trace whatever records existed of men who had once served under fallen lords, to find some mention, however small, of a person once known only as the Falcon. She followed Lucy down into the archive wing, unaware that somewhere above them, in a private chamber overlooking the courtyard, Gareth Voss stood at his window, watching the spot where she had disappeared from view, turning over in his mind a question that troubled him more than he wished to admit. He had met countless prisoners, hostages, and reluctant servants over the years. None of them had ever looked at him the way Clara Bennett had, not with fear, and not with defiance, but with the quiet calculation of someone already 3 steps ahead, in a game only she seemed to know was being played. The archive wing was colder than the rest of the fortress, tucked into a lower level where sunlight rarely reached. Shelves of records stretched from floor to ceiling, filled with ledgers, maps, and correspondence spanning decades of the region's history. Lucy led Clara between the towering shelves, explaining the basic organization of the room in short, practical sentences. "Tribute records here," Lucy said, gesturing toward one section. "Military correspondence there. Anything involving the old lords who once ruled before the king took control is kept in the back, though most of it hasn't been touched in years." Clara's attention sharpened at the mention of the old lords, though she kept her expression neutral. "Why keep records no one reads?" "The king believes information is never truly useless," Lucy said. "Even old secrets can matter again, given enough time." It was, Clara thought, a fitting philosophy for a man who had survived by trusting almost nothing left to chance. As they moved deeper into the archive, a man emerged from between 2 shelves, tall and sharp-featured, his eyes immediately fixing on Clara, with an intensity that made her spine straighten. He wore the dark robes of someone who held authority beyond simple soldiering, and the way Lucy's posture stiffened beside her suggested this was someone whose attention was not easily earned, nor easily escaped. "Victor Kane," Lucy said quietly, by way of introduction. "The king's advisor. He oversees the archive wing personally." Victor studied Clara for a long moment before speaking, his voice smooth, measured, the voice of a man accustomed to extracting truth from careful silence. "The new arrival from Millhaven. I heard you impressed the king this morning. I answered his questions honestly, Clara said. Honesty, Victor repeated, as if testing the word for hidden meaning. A rare commodity in this fortress. Most people who arrive here learn quickly that honesty is a luxury best used sparingly. Then perhaps I haven't learned the lesson yet. A faint smile crossed Victor's face, though it did not reach his eyes. Perhaps not. Tell me, Clara Bennett, what exactly did you mean when you told the king you notice small details other people overlook? Clara held his gaze steadily. Exactly what I said, nothing more mysterious than that. Everything in this fortress is mysterious, until proven otherwise, Victor said. I find it useful to assume nothing is as simple as it first appears. It has kept me alive far longer than most advisors in similar positions. He turned and walked back toward the deeper shelves without waiting for a response, leaving Clara with the distinct impression that her presence had already drawn far more attention than she intended this early in her time at Ravenspire. Lucy exhaled quietly once he was gone. Victor notices everyone, Lucy said. It's part of his role, but he rarely bothers speaking directly to new arrivals, unless something about them catches his interest. And what do you think caught his interest? Clara asked. Lucy studied her carefully. I think you already know the answer to that better than I do. The two women continued through the archive in silence after that, Lucy showing Clara the basic tasks expected of her, organizing scrolls, cataloging correspondence, maintaining records that stretched back further than either of them had been alive. It was tedious work by design, the kind meant to keep idle hands busy, and idle minds distracted. But for Clara, it was exactly the opportunity she needed. Every shelf, every ledger, every forgotten correspondence between long-dead lords represented a possible thread leading back to her father's disappearance. That night, alone in her small chamber once again, Clara unfolded the coded fragment and studied it beneath the flickering light of a single candle. The reference to the falcon nagged at her thoughts, alongside Victor Kane's sharp, assessing gaze, and the strange coincidence that the fortress seemed to be watched by unseen eyes from beyond its walls, just as it watched everyone within them. Somewhere in this archive, she suspected, lay the answer to a question that had haunted her for years. She simply needed time, patience, and enough caution to avoid drawing the kind of attention that would end her search before it truly began. Outside her window, the torches of Ravenspire burned steadily into the night, and far beyond the fortress walls, in the dark hills surrounding it, a lone figure watched the same walls with patience of his own, waiting for the right moment to act on information he had already gathered about the woman recently brought inside. Days passed in Ravenspire with a rhythm Clara had not expected from a place with such a fearsome reputation. Mornings began early, the archive wing filling with soft light through narrow windows near the ceiling, and by midday, the routine of cataloging scrolls and organizing correspondence had settled into something almost peaceful. It was, Clara realized, precisely the kind of peace that made people careless, and she intended to use that carelessness to her advantage. She learned the names of the other servants quickly, though few of them spoke to her beyond simple courtesy. A young guard named Nathaniel Hale patrolled the corridor outside the archive wing most afternoons, his eyes lingering on Clara longer than professional duty required. He was polite enough in conversation, though something about his questions felt calculated rather than casual. Small inquiries about where she had come from, what her family had done before Millhaven, whether she had traveled much before arriving at the fortress. You ask a lot of questions for a guard simply passing through, Clara said one afternoon, when his curiosity crossed from subtle into obvious. Nathaniel offered a practiced smile. Can't blame a man for being curious about the newest addition to the household, especially one who managed to earn the king's personal attention on her very first day. I answered a few questions honestly. That hardly counts as earning special attention. Around here, Nathaniel said, leaning casually against the doorway. Honesty is attention. The king doesn't waste time on people who don't interest him. Clara filed away his phrasing carefully, noting how closely it echoed Victor Kane's earlier words. Either the fortress had cultivated a shared philosophy among its most watchful residents, or Nathaniel had been specifically instructed to observe her, perhaps by Victor himself, perhaps by someone else entirely. That evening, while cataloging a stack of old correspondence dating back nearly 2 decades, Clara found the first genuine thread connecting her research to something real. A letter, half-faded, referenced payments made to a group of men working under a lord, whose name had been carefully struck through in later records, as though someone had tried to erase him from history entirely. Beside the strike-through, in smaller handwriting, someone had written a single word: Falcon. Her pulse quickened, though she kept her expression carefully neutral, aware that Lucy worked at a nearby table, occasionally glancing up from her own tasks. "Everything all right?" Lucy asked, noticing Clara's sudden stillness. "Just an interesting piece of history," Clara said, folding the letter carefully and setting it aside with a stack of documents meant for further review, ensuring it would not immediately draw suspicion if anyone checked her work later. Lucy studied her for a moment longer before returning to her own tasks, though something in her expression suggested she did not entirely believe the casual explanation. Clara made a mental note to be more careful, aware that even the friendliest face in the fortress might report unusual behavior if pressed by someone with enough authority. Later that night, alone in her chamber, Clara compared the newly discovered reference to the fragment of coded letter she carried from home. The pieces did not fully align yet, but the shape of a larger picture was beginning to form, one involving a fallen lord, a group of men working in secret, and someone known only by the name Falcon, a person whose identity had been deliberately hidden from the historical record. Her father, she suspected, had known exactly who that person was, and whoever had ordered his silence likely still walked the halls of power somewhere in the region, possibly even within Ravenspire itself. The following days brought a shift in the fortress atmosphere that even Clara, careful as she was, could not fail to notice. Soldiers moved with increased urgency through the corridors, whispered conversations halting abruptly whenever servants passed too closely. Lucy grew tense and distracted, offering no explanation despite Clara's careful questions. "Something's happening," Clara said finally, cornering Lucy near the archive entrance one evening. Lucy glanced around before answering, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "There's been trouble with the grain shipments coming into the fortress. Some of the stores meant for the winter reserves have gone bad, faster than they should have. The king suspects it isn't simply poor luck." "Sabotage?" "No one's saying that word out loud," Lucy said, "but that's what everyone's thinking." Clara considered this new information carefully, recognizing immediately how it connected to everything else she had observed since arriving. The unseen figure in the mountain pass, Victor Kane's careful scrutiny, Nathaniel Hale's probing questions, and now trouble within the fortress's own supply chain. Someone, it seemed, was working against Gareth Voss, from multiple directions at once, patient and careful enough to avoid detection so far. If Clara could uncover who was responsible, she suspected it might also lead her closer to understanding her father's fate, and the shadowy figure known only as the Falcon. That night, unable to sleep, Clara made her way quietly back toward the archive wing, careful to avoid the patrol routes she had memorized during her time cataloging records. The room was dark and silent, moonlight filtering weakly through the high windows, and she moved carefully toward the section of correspondence dealing with supply logistics, searching for any pattern that might explain the recent spoilage. She had barely begun searching when the sound of footsteps in the corridor outside made her freeze. Someone was approaching, deliberately quiet, clearly not wanting to be noticed any more than she did. Clara slipped behind a tall shelf just as the archive door creaked open, and a figure entered the room, moving with practiced stealth toward the same section of records she had been examining moments before. From her position behind the shelf, Clara watched the figure move with careful precision, hands sifting through the same stack of supply correspondence she had set aside earlier that evening. Moonlight caught the edge of the intruder's face for a brief moment, and Clara recognized him immediately. Nathaniel Hale. She held her breath, watching him work through the documents with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this many times before, someone far more skilled than a simple guard had any reason to be. He paused occasionally, holding certain letters up toward the moonlight, studying them with an intensity that confirmed Clara's growing suspicion that his earlier questions about her background had not been idle curiosity at all. After several minutes, Nathaniel folded a handful of documents into his jacket and turned to leave, moving toward the door with the same careful silence he had used entering. Clara remained still until his footsteps faded completely down the corridor, her mind racing through the implications of what she had just witnessed. A guard within the fortress, secretly removing supply records in the middle of the night, shortly after grain stores had inexplicably spoiled. It was not proof of sabotage, not on its own, but it was exactly the kind of thread Clara knew how to follow. She waited nearly 10 minutes before finally emerging from her hiding place, moving quickly to examine what remained of the correspondence Nathaniel had been searching through. Most of the important documents were gone, taken along with whatever secrets they contained, but a single sheet remained, overlooked in his haste, tucked beneath a heavier ledger. Clara unfolded it carefully. It was a simple shipping manifest, listing grain deliveries from several outlying farms over the past few months, nothing unusual at first glance. But as she studied the numbers more closely, comparing delivery dates against quantities recorded elsewhere in the archive, a pattern began to emerge. Certain shipments, all originating from the same cluster of farms, had been delayed by exactly 2 days on multiple occasions, just long enough, perhaps, for something to be added to the grain before it reached the fortress stores. It was circumstantial, nothing close to definitive proof, but it was enough to suggest a deliberate pattern rather than simple bad fortune. Clara folded the manifest carefully and tucked it into her sleeve alongside her father's coded fragment, aware that she now carried 2 separate mysteries that might, somehow, be connected. She made her way back to her chamber before dawn, moving as carefully as Nathaniel had, aware that if anyone discovered her wandering the archive after hours, explaining her presence would prove far more difficult than it had for a guard, with legitimate reason to patrol the fortress at night. The following morning brought news that spread through Ravenspire like wildfire. Another portion of the winter grain stores had been found spoiled overnight, this time in quantities significant enough that even the kitchen staff could no longer pretend the losses were simply bad luck. Clara heard the whispers as she made her way toward the archive wing, servants speaking in hushed, worried tones about what the loss might mean for the fortress once winter fully arrived. Lucy found her shortly after, her expression tighter than Clara had seen it since their first meeting. "The king has called a meeting of his senior staff," Lucy said, Victor Kane included. "They're trying to determine whether this is truly sabotage, and if so, who might be responsible." Clara considered revealing what she had witnessed the previous night, the shipping manifest hidden in her sleeve, Nathaniel's suspicious search through the archive records. But caution held her back. She barely understood the situation herself, and revealing partial information too early might expose her own late-night activities without providing anything conclusive in return. Worse, if Nathaniel truly was working for someone beyond the fortress walls, exposing him prematurely might alert whoever he answered to, losing whatever advantage her discovery currently offered. Instead, she spent the following days quietly gathering more information, cross-referencing delivery records against the farms Nathaniel had been most interested in, searching for any additional pattern that might strengthen her suspicion into something closer to certainty. Each evening, she returned to her chamber, exhausted but increasingly convinced that the sabotage, whoever was truly responsible, traced back to a deliberate and patient plan rather than any simple accident. Meanwhile, tension within the fortress continued to rise. Soldiers doubled their patrols along the outer walls. Victor Kane grew increasingly present within the archive wing, watching over the servants with an intensity that made even Lucy visibly nervous. And Gareth Voss himself, according to whispers among the household staff, had grown short-tempered and distracted, spending long hours locked away in private meetings with his senior officers, searching for answers that continued to elude him. Clara understood, watching the fortress tighten around itself like a fist, that whatever crisis was building would not remain contained much longer. And when it finally broke, she suspected the truth she had been quietly assembling might become impossible to keep hidden, whether she was ready to reveal it or not. One evening, as she catalogued a final stack of correspondence before retiring for the night, Victor Kane appeared beside her table, with the silent precision that seemed to define everything he did. "You've been spending considerable time reviewing our supply records," he said, his voice carrying no obvious accusation, though his eyes studied her with the same sharp scrutiny he had shown their first meeting. "The king asked that all records be properly catalogued," Clara replied evenly. "Supply correspondence is part of that responsibility." "Of course." Victor's expression remained unreadable. "Though I find it curious that your particular attention has focused so heavily on shipments from the outlying farms, precisely the same shipments currently under suspicion for the recent spoilage." Clara kept her expression carefully neutral, aware that whatever she said next would determine how much trust, or suspicion, Victor carried toward her, moving forward. "If there's a pattern worth noticing in those records," she said carefully, "wouldn't it serve the fortress better for someone to notice it, rather than overlook it?" For a long moment, Victor said nothing, simply studying her, with an expression that suggested he was recalculating something important about the woman before him. Finally he spoke, his voice quieter than before. "The king will want to hear whatever pattern you believe you found. Tomorrow morning, present yourself before the council. And Clara Bennett," he added, turning to leave, "I would advise you to be entirely certain of your conclusions before you do." Clara watched him disappear down the corridor, her heart pounding despite her carefully composed exterior. The moment she had both anticipated and dreaded had arrived far sooner than she expected. Tomorrow, she would be forced to reveal at least part of what she had discovered, whether she felt fully prepared or not. The council chamber was smaller than the great hall where Clara had first met the Wolf King, but it carried a weight of its own. Dark wood walls lined with maps of the surrounding territory, a long table where several senior officers already sat waiting when she arrived. Gareth Voss occupied the seat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable as always, though the tightness around his eyes suggested days of insufficient sleep. Victor Kane stood near the window, arms crossed, watching Clara enter with quiet expectation. Roland Blake sat among the officers, his gaze flicking toward Clara with obvious curiosity. And near the far end of the table, arms folded, expression carefully neutral, sat Nathaniel Hale. Clara felt her pulse quicken at the sight of him, aware that whatever she revealed in the coming minutes would need to be presented with extreme care. Naming him directly, without stronger proof than a single midnight observation, could easily backfire, especially if he had already covered his tracks or prepared an explanation for his presence in the archive that night. "You asked to address the council regarding the recent grain spoilage," Gareth said, his voice carrying no warmth, simply business. "Speak." Clara stepped forward, keeping her voice steady, despite the weight of every gaze in the room settling upon her. "While cataloging supply correspondence, I noticed a pattern in the delivery records from several outlying farms. Shipments from this particular cluster," she said, unfolding a set of notes she had prepared carefully the previous night, "were consistently delayed by exactly 2 days, on multiple occasions over the past several months. Always the same farms, always the same delay." She placed the notes on the table, allowing the officers to examine the pattern themselves, rather than simply taking her word for it. Roland leaned forward, studying the numbers with visible interest. 2 days is not an unusual delay for shipments crossing difficult terrain, one of the older officers said, his tone dismissive. "It isn't," Clara agreed, "except that these particular farms lie along the flattest, most direct route into the fortress. Every other shipment along that route arrives on schedule. Only shipments from this specific cluster experience the delay, and only these shipments have gone bad once they reached our stores." Silence settled over the table, as the officers absorbed the implication. Gareth studied the notes carefully, his expression sharpening with the same focused intensity Clara had noticed during their first meeting. "You're suggesting someone is intercepting these shipments during that 2-day window," Gareth said slowly, "tampering with the grain before it ever reaches our walls." "It would explain the pattern," Clara said carefully, "though I cannot yet say who, or how." Victor Kane stepped forward from his position near the window, his sharp eyes moving between Clara and the notes spread across the table. "This is meticulous work for someone recently assigned to simple cataloging duties," he said, his tone carrying an edge Clara recognized immediately, as suspicion rather than genuine praise. "I told the king when we first met that I noticed details others overlook," Clara replied evenly. "This is simply an example of that." "A convenient example," Victor said, arriving precisely when the fortress most needed someone to notice it. The insinuation hung heavy in the air, and Clara felt every eye in the room shift subtly toward her, reconsidering the trustworthiness of the very information she had just presented. She had anticipated this reaction, though facing it directly still required more composure than she expected. "If suspicion of me is more valuable to this council than solving the problem itself," Clara said, keeping her voice calm despite the tension building in her chest, "then perhaps the pattern I've found should be verified independently before anyone decides whether to trust the person who found it." Gareth studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. Then he turned toward Roland. Send men to intercept the next shipment from these farms personally. Watch the full 2-day window Clara has identified. If nothing unusual occurs, we will know her pattern was coincidence. If something does occur, he added, his gaze shifting back toward Clara, we will know precisely how much attention her observations deserve going forward. It was, Clara realized, a fair test. Exactly the kind of measured response she would have expected from a man who had survived years of court politics and battlefield uncertainty by trusting almost nothing without verification. She nodded her agreement, aware that the coming days would determine far more than simply whether her theory about the grain proved correct. As the council meeting concluded, and the officers began filing out of the chamber, Nathaniel Hale lingered near the doorway, his eyes meeting Clara's briefly, before he turned to leave. There was nothing overtly hostile in his expression, nothing that would draw the attention of anyone else in the room. But Clara recognized the subtle warning contained in that single glance, the silent acknowledgement that he, too, understood exactly how close her discovery had come to exposing something he clearly intended to keep hidden. That evening, Lucy found Clara in the archive wing, her expression a mixture of admiration and concern. Word is already spreading through the household, Lucy said, about what you presented to the council. Some people are saying you might be the sharpest mind this fortress has seen in years. Others are saying you're either very clever or very dangerous. Why not both? Clara asked, allowing herself a small, tired smile. Lucy did not smile back, because in this fortress, being both usually means someone eventually decides you're too dangerous to keep around, regardless of how clever you've proven yourself. Clara considered the warning carefully, aware that Lucy's words carried more truth than casual concern. She had drawn exactly the kind of attention she needed to advance her search for answers about her father, but that same attention now placed her squarely within the sights of whoever was working to undermine Gareth Voss from within his own walls. If Nathaniel Hale was indeed connected to the sabotage, and if he now recognized Clara as a genuine threat to his continued success, she suspected he would not simply allow her to continue investigating unchallenged. That night, unable to shake the tension of the day's events, Clara returned once more to her father's coded fragment, studying the faded symbols beneath candlelight, until her eyes grew heavy with exhaustion. The reference to the falcon remained frustratingly incomplete, though a new thought occurred to her as she traced the familiar cipher pattern once again. What if the falcon was not simply a person, but a code name for someone still active within positions of power today? What if the very sabotage currently threatening Ravenspire's winter survival was connected, however distantly, to the same shadowy figure her father had once known, the same figure whose exposure had cost him everything? It was a theory without proof, fragile and speculative, but it settled into Clara's mind with the persistent weight of something that refused to be dismissed. She fell asleep that night with the coded fragment still clutched in her hand, dreaming of falcons circling above a fortress, under siege from enemies no one could yet clearly see. 3 days later, word arrived that the men sent to watch the outlying farms had returned. Clara heard the news before she saw Roland Blake himself, servants whispering through the corridors about riders arriving at dawn with grim expressions and urgent reports for the king. She was summoned to the council chamber again by midday, this time finding the room already tense with activity. Maps spread across the table, Roland standing near the window with dust still clinging to his boots from the road. "Tell her what you found," Gareth said, his eyes fixed on Clara as she entered. Roland's expression was grim. "We watched the shipment exactly as planned, followed it from the farm cluster along the full route toward the fortress. Nothing seemed unusual until the wagon reached a narrow section of forest, roughly halfway through the journey. There, the driver stopped, claiming a wheel needed repair. My men observed from cover, and within the hour, 3 riders arrived from the tree line, unloaded several sacks from the wagon, replaced them with others, and disappeared back into the forest before we could intercept them." The room fell silent, the implication settling heavily over everyone present. Clara's pattern had proven correct. The grain truly was being tampered with during transit, deliberately, systematically, by riders who clearly understood the fortress's supply routes well enough to strike without detection. "Did your men get a good look at them?" Victor Kane asked, his earlier suspicion of Clara now replaced by focused concern over the larger threat the discovery represented. "Cloaked, careful to hide their faces," Roland said, "but one of my men recognized the horse one rider used, a distinctive marking on its foreleg. He'd seen that same horse before, stabled here within Ravenspire itself. Every eye in the room turned instinctively toward one another, an unspoken question passing silently between the assembled officers. If the horse belonged to someone within the fortress, then whoever orchestrated the sabotage was not simply an external threat working from the shadows. They had allies, or perhaps direct agents, operating from within Ravenspire's own walls. Clara felt the weight of the moment pressing down around her, aware that this revelation placed everyone in the room under a fresh cloud of suspicion, herself included. She thought immediately of Nathaniel Hale, of his midnight search through the archive, of the careful, probing questions he had asked since her very first day in the fortress. But she held her tongue, unwilling to name him without stronger proof than a single suspicious glance and an unverified late-night observation. "We will need to identify which horse and which rider," Gareth said, his voice carrying the controlled fury of a man determined to root out betrayal from within his own household. Quietly, "If word spreads that we suspect someone inside these walls, whoever is responsible will simply go further underground, and we lose our chance to catch them before more damage is done." The council meeting concluded with instructions for Roland to discreetly investigate the fortress stables, checking every horse against the marking his soldier had described, while Victor Kane was tasked with quietly reviewing the movements of household staff during the specific hours the ambush had occurred. Clara, meanwhile, was instructed to continue her review of supply records, searching for any further patterns that might reveal additional vulnerabilities the saboteurs had already exploited, or might exploit in the future. As the room emptied, Gareth remained seated, watching Clara with an expression she could not quite decipher. "You found something the rest of my council overlooked entirely," he said, once the others had filed out. "Twice now, in fact, once regarding the shipment pattern, and now, indirectly, regarding a threat operating from within these very walls." "I simply noticed a pattern," Clara said carefully. "The credit for uncovering the ambush belongs to Roland and his men." "Modesty," Gareth said, studying her closely, "is either a genuine virtue or a very effective disguise. I find myself increasingly uncertain which applies to you, Clara Bennett." Clara held his gaze steadily, aware that beneath his measured, careful words lay a question he had not yet directly asked, one she suspected he was building toward with each passing observation. Who, exactly, was she? And why had someone with such evident skill allowed herself to be traded away like ordinary tribute from a struggling village? "Perhaps," Clara said finally, choosing her words with deliberate care, "it is simply easier to notice details when you have spent your entire life being underestimated by everyone around you." Something flickered behind Gareth's eyes at those words, an expression that looked almost like recognition, as though her answer had touched upon something he understood personally far better than most. He said nothing further, simply nodding once, before dismissing her from the chamber, though Clara left with the distinct impression that whatever careful trust was building between them, it remained fragile, easily broken by the wrong revelation at the wrong moment. That night, sleep proved elusive once again. Clara sat by her window, watching torchlight flicker across the courtyard below, turning over everything she had learned since arriving at Ravenspire. A saboteur working from within the fortress. A shadowy figure known only as the Falcon, connected somehow to her father's disappearance years before. A guard whose suspicious behavior might, or might not, connect to either mystery. And a king, who watched her with growing curiosity, that felt less like suspicion now, and more like something far more complicated, something Clara did not yet have the clarity to fully name. She suspected, watching the torches burn steadily against the darkness, that the fragile peace currently holding Ravenspire together would not last much longer. Whoever was working against Gareth Voss from within his own walls had shown themselves willing to risk exposure once already. It seemed only a matter of time before they were forced to act again, more boldly, more dangerously, and Clara intended to be ready when that moment finally arrived. The following days passed with deceptive calm, though Clara noticed the fortress had changed in subtle ways since the council meeting. Guards patrolled with sharper attention now, watching not just the outer walls but the corridors within, and conversations among the household staff had grown quieter, more careful, as though everyone sensed that trust within Ravenspire had become a fragile and dangerous thing to extend carelessly. Roland's search of the stables produced results within 3 days. A horse matching the distinctive foreleg marking belonged, according to the stable records, to a soldier who had left the fortress's service nearly 2 months earlier, citing family obligations back in his home village. The horse, however, had never left Ravenspire's grounds, remaining stabled under a different assigned rider ever since. That assigned rider was Nathaniel Hale. Clara learned this from Lucy, who delivered the news in a hurried whisper during a quiet moment in the archive wing, her expression tight with barely contained anxiety. Roland brought the information straight to the king this morning. They're questioning Nathaniel right now, in the lower chambers. Clara's pulse quickened, though she kept her hands steady as she continued sorting through the correspondence in front of her, aware that Lucy was watching her reaction closely. What will happen to him? That depends on what he says, Lucy replied, and how much of it the king believes. For the remainder of that day, tension hung over the fortress like an approaching storm, every servant and soldier moving with the careful awareness that something significant was unfolding behind closed doors. Clara forced herself to continue her work, cataloging records with outward calm, even as her mind raced through the implications of Nathaniel's exposure. If he confessed to working with outside forces, it would confirm everything Clara had suspected since witnessing his midnight search through the archive. But it might also mean losing her only lead connecting the sabotage to whatever larger conspiracy had once cost her father his life. If Nathaniel was simply a minor agent, easily replaced, then whoever truly commanded him from beyond the fortress walls would remain hidden, untouched, and free to try again through some other means. She was proven right to worry sooner than expected. That evening, as the fortress settled into its usual nighttime quiet, a commotion erupted near the eastern wall, shouts and the clash of steel cutting through the darkness with sudden violence. Clara rushed to her window, watching torches scatter across the courtyard below as soldiers converged toward the disturbance. Lucy burst into her chamber moments later, breathless. Nathaniel escaped custody. He's making for the eastern gate. Clara followed Lucy through the corridors without hesitation, joining the flow of servants and soldiers rushing toward the growing chaos near the fortress walls. By the time they reached a vantage point overlooking the eastern courtyard, Clara could see Nathaniel cornered near the smaller gate she had noticed on her very first day at Ravenspire, surrounded by soldiers with weapons drawn, Gareth himself standing at the front of the assembled group, his expression carved from cold fury. "There's nowhere left to run," Gareth said, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. "Confess who you serve, and perhaps some measure of mercy remains possible." Nathaniel's eyes darted between the surrounding soldiers, calculating, desperate, though something in his posture suggested he had already accepted the impossibility of true escape. "You already know enough," he said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "The Falcon does not tolerate failure, and I have already failed too many times for mercy to matter." The word struck Clara like a physical blow. She gripped the stone windowsill beside her, steadying herself as the implications crashed through her thoughts. The Falcon. The same name hidden within her father's coded fragment. The same mysterious figure connected to whatever secret had cost her family everything years before. Here was confirmation, spoken aloud in the middle of a fortress courtyard, that the Falcon was not simply a figure from the past, but an active, dangerous presence, still shaping events in the present. Gareth's expression shifted subtly at the mention of the name, something flickering behind his controlled fury that looked almost like recognition. "The Falcon," he repeated slowly. "You will tell me everything you know about that name, Nathaniel, or you will tell me nothing, ever again." Nathaniel's laugh was bitter, edged with the particular despair of a man who understood he had already lost regardless of what choice he made next. "You think naming him changes anything? The Falcon has eyes and ears in places you have never even considered, Gareth Voss. This fortress, this council. Perhaps even closer to your own chair than you would ever suspect." The soldiers tightened their circle at these words, and for a tense moment, it seemed the confrontation might end in bloodshed rather than answers. But Gareth raised a hand, halting his men before violence could erupt. "Take him to the lower chambers," he said finally, "alive. Whatever he knows, we will extract it carefully and completely." As soldiers moved to restrain Nathaniel, his eyes swept briefly across the gathered crowd of onlookers, finding Clara's face among them, despite the distance and darkness separating them. Something passed across his expression in that final moment, recognition perhaps, or a warning, though Clara could not be entirely certain which. Then he was gone, dragged toward the lower chambers, and the courtyard slowly emptied as the immediate crisis subsided into uneasy quiet. Clara returned to her chamber that night with her thoughts in complete disarray. The Falcon was real, active, dangerous enough that even a hardened soldier like Nathaniel feared the consequences of failure more than capture itself. And somehow, impossibly, this figure connected both to her father's disappearance years earlier and to the current threat facing Ravenspire. She spent the remainder of the night studying her father's coded fragment once more, searching for any detail she might have previously overlooked. This time, cross-referencing the cipher against phrases she had encountered in the archive's older correspondence. A fuller picture finally began emerging from the fragmented text. The message referenced a debt owed by someone in a position of significant authority, someone who had used the Falcon's services years before to eliminate a political rival, and who had subsequently ensured that everyone with knowledge of the arrangement, including the men who carried it out, disappeared from public record entirely. Her father had been one of those men. Clara sat back from the fragment, her heart pounding as the full weight of the revelation settled over her. Her father had not vanished due to some vague, unexplained misfortune. He had been silenced, deliberately, to protect someone whose identity remained frustratingly obscured within the coded text. And now, years later, that same shadowy network appeared to be working against Gareth Voss himself, using agents like Nathaniel Hale to weaken Ravenspire from within. Whatever answers she still needed, Clara suspected they now lay locked behind whatever information Nathaniel Hale was prepared to reveal, or refused to reveal, within the fortress's lower chambers. And she intended to find a way to hear that confession herself, regardless of the risk involved in doing so. The opportunity Clara needed arrived sooner than expected, though not in the manner she had anticipated. Early the following morning, before the household had fully stirred from sleep, a servant arrived at her chamber door, with a summons from the king himself, requesting her presence in the lower chambers immediately. Clara dressed quickly, her mind racing through possibilities, as she followed the servant down through the fortress, toward the same chambers where Nathaniel had been taken the previous night. She found Gareth waiting outside a heavy wooden door, flanked by 2 guards, his expression exhausted but focused, the look of a man who had not slept since the previous evening's confrontation. "Nathaniel has said very little," Gareth said without preamble as Clara approached. "Threats have not moved him, neither has the promise of leniency. But he mentioned something before falling silent entirely, a fragment of information that meant nothing to my officers, but which I suspect might mean something to you." Clara's pulse quickened. "What did he say?" "He spoke of a debt owed by silence," Gareth said, watching her reaction carefully. "And a name, spoken so quietly my guards nearly missed it entirely. Bennett." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Clara felt the careful composure she had maintained since arriving at Ravenspire threatened to crack entirely, though she forced herself to remain outwardly calm despite the storm of emotion suddenly churning beneath the surface. "That is my family name," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I am aware," Gareth said quietly, "which is precisely why I summoned you, rather than dismissing the comment as meaningless prisoners rambling. Tell me honestly, Clara, is there a connection between you and whatever secret Nathaniel is protecting?" Clara stood silent for a long moment, weighing the risk of revealing too much against the greater risk of continuing to withhold information that might now prove essential to understanding the full threat facing Ravenspire. Finally, she made her decision. "My father served under a lord many years ago," she said carefully. "A lord who fell from favor, and whose entire household disappeared shortly afterward, my father included. I have spent years trying to understand what truly happened to him. Recently, I discovered a coded fragment among his belongings, one that references a figure known only as the Falcon, and a debt owed for services rendered in silence." Gareth's expression sharpened with sudden understanding. "This is why you volunteered yourself as tribute," he said slowly. "Not out of loyalty to your village, but because you believed coming here might lead you closer to answers about your father." "Yes," Clara admitted, seeing no further reason to deny it. "I did not expect to find those answers so quickly, or in such dangerous circumstances, but I believe now that whatever destroyed my father's household years ago is connected to whoever currently seeks to destroy yours." For a long moment, Gareth said nothing, simply studying her, with an expression that had shifted from suspicion into something far more complicated. respect mixed uneasily with wariness, curiosity tangled with something that looked almost like recognition of a kindred struggle. "You have been investigating my fortress's enemies this entire time," he said finally. "Not for my sake, but for your own." "Does the reason matter?" Clara asked, "if the results serve us both equally?" A ghost of something that might have been a smile crossed Gareth's face, gone as quickly as it appeared. "Perhaps not," he admitted. "Come. If Nathaniel responds to any name, it may as well be tested now, while we still have the chance to learn something useful from him." He led her through the heavy wooden door into a small, sparsely furnished chamber, where Nathaniel sat bound to a chair, his expression haggard, but still carrying traces of the calculating intelligence Clara had noticed since their very first conversation. His eyes widened slightly upon seeing her enter alongside the king. "Clara Bennett," Gareth said, his voice carrying quiet authority. "Tell him who you are." Nathaniel's gaze fixed on Clara with sudden sharp intensity. "Bennett," he repeated softly, something shifting behind his exhausted eyes. "I wondered. When I first heard your name back in Millhaven, I told myself it was simply coincidence." "You knew my father," Clara said, stepping closer despite Gareth's cautionary hand rising slightly beside her. "I knew of him," Nathaniel corrected. "Everyone who has ever worked closely with the Falcons network eventually hears whispers about the men who came before, the ones who served their purpose and were subsequently silenced to protect those above them. Your father's name was spoken sometimes, as a warning, an example of what happens to those who eventually become inconvenient." Clara's hands trembled slightly, though she forced herself to remain composed. "Who is the Falcon? Tell me his true identity." Nathaniel's laugh carried genuine, exhausted despair. "If I knew that with certainty, do you think I would still be sitting here, bound and waiting for whatever punishment your king decides to deliver? The Falcon's true identity is protected more carefully than any secret I have ever encountered. Even those of us who serve his network directly know him only through intermediaries, coded instructions, and consequences, delivered swiftly, whenever those instructions are ignored." Gareth stepped forward, his expression hardening. "Then tell us what you do know. Every intermediary, every coded instruction, every detail, no matter how small. Your cooperation is the only leverage remaining to you now." Nathaniel studied both of them for a long, weighing moment before finally, wearily, beginning to speak, and as he did, Clara felt the fragmented pieces of years of searching finally beginning to align into something resembling a complete and dangerous picture. Nathaniel's confession, delivered in halting fragments over the following hour, painted a picture more complicated than Clara had anticipated. The Falcon, he explained, operated through a careful network of intermediaries scattered across the region, each one aware of only a small piece of the larger operation, ensuring that no single capture or confession could expose the entire structure. Nathaniel himself had been recruited nearly 3 years earlier, approached by a traveling merchant who offered generous payment in exchange for occasional information about troop movements and supply routes, within whatever territory Nathaniel happened to be serving. "It began small," Nathaniel said, his voice hollow with exhaustion. "Information about grain shipments, patrol schedules, nothing that seemed to cause any real harm. By the time I understood the true purpose behind these requests, refusing was no longer a safe option. The Falcon's network does not release those who wish to leave. It only replaces those who become unreliable." "And the sabotage here at Ravenspire?" Gareth pressed. "Whose orders were those?" "Instructions arrived through the same merchant contact who first recruited me," Nathaniel said. "Weaken the fortress's winter reserves, create instability within the household, sow distrust among your senior officers. I was never told why. Only that the Falcon believed a weakened Ravenspire served some larger purpose he did not explain to men at my level of involvement." Clara listened carefully, cross-referencing every detail against the coded fragment she had spent years trying to fully decipher. The pattern of small, seemingly insignificant tasks, escalating gradually into larger betrayals, matched precisely what she now understood about her father's own involvement decades earlier. It was, she realized, a deliberate method. One designed to ensnare people gradually enough that by the time they recognized the true weight of what they had become entangled in, escape was no longer a realistic option. "This merchant contact," Clara said, stepping closer. "Describe him." Nathaniel's eyes flickered toward her with something like reluctant respect. Older, gray at the temples, always traveling under a different name depending on the town. But there was one detail that remained consistent: a ring he wore on his left hand, a falcon carved into dark stone. The description meant nothing specific to Clara, though she committed every detail carefully to memory, aware that even the smallest fragment of information might eventually connect to something larger. Gareth, however, straightened suddenly beside her, his expression shifting into something sharper, more alert. "I have seen a ring matching that description," he said slowly, "though I cannot yet recall precisely where." The revelation hung heavily in the room, and Clara felt a fresh wave of urgency settle over her. If Gareth himself had encountered someone connected to the Falcon's network, perhaps unknowingly, then the threat facing Ravenspire ran deeper and closer than any of them had previously realized. The remainder of Nathaniel's confession offered little additional clarity regarding the Falcon's true identity, though it confirmed the existence of at least 2 other agents operating within neighboring territories, both recruited through similar methods, both reporting through separate intermediaries to avoid any single point of failure within the network. Gareth ordered Nathaniel held under close guard, neither executed immediately nor released, a decision that surprised several of his officers when word eventually spread through the fortress. "He may yet prove useful," Gareth explained later that evening, when Victor Kane questioned the wisdom of showing leniency toward a confirmed traitor. "A man already exposed, already stripped of his usefulness to the Falcon's network, may become willing to help us identify his former handlers, if given sufficient incentive to do so." Victor remained skeptical, though he did not press the matter further, his attention instead shifting increasingly toward Clara herself. Over the following days, Clara noticed his scrutiny intensifying, subtle questions disguised as casual conversation, careful observations of her movements throughout the archive wing, an unmistakable pattern of a man determined to understand exactly how much trust her recent revelations truly deserved. "You've become quite valuable to the king rather quickly," Victor observed one afternoon, finding her alone among the archive shelves, first identifying the sabotage pattern, and now revealing a personal connection to the very network responsible for it. "Some might find that combination of circumstances remarkably convenient." "Or remarkably unfortunate," Clara replied evenly, "depending on how you choose to view years of searching for answers about my father's disappearance." "Perhaps," Victor said, though his tone carried clear reservation. "I have served this fortress a long time, Clara Bennett. Long enough to recognize when circumstances align too neatly to be entirely coincidental. I do not yet know what to make of you, but I intend to watch closely until I do." Clara held his gaze without flinching, aware that Victor's suspicion, however uncomfortable, was not entirely unreasonable, given everything that had unfolded since her arrival. She had, after all, entered Ravenspire with a hidden agenda of her own, one that had only partially aligned with the fortress's immediate needs by fortunate coincidence rather than deliberate design. "Watch as closely as you wish," Clara said finally. "I have nothing further to hide from this council that I have not already revealed." It was, she knew, even as she spoke the words, not entirely true. She had not yet mentioned the ring Gareth claimed to recognize, unwilling to raise expectations before either of them had time to properly investigate the memory further. Nor had she revealed the full extent of her own skills, the years of training her father had provided before his disappearance. Skills that went far beyond simply noticing small details others overlooked. That evening, Gareth summoned her privately to a smaller study adjoining the main council chamber, a room lined with maps and personal correspondence, rather than official fortress records. He appeared troubled, pacing slowly near the window as Clara entered. "I remembered where I saw the ring," he said without preamble. 3 years ago, at a gathering of regional lords convened to discuss shifting alliances following the previous war's conclusion. A merchant attended briefly, delivering correspondence on behalf of a lord who could not attend personally. I paid him little attention at the time, beyond noting the unusual ring he wore. "Do you remember which lord he represented?" Clara asked, her pulse quickening. Gareth's expression darkened. "Lord Edric Calloway. A man whose territory borders my own to the east, someone I have always considered, if not a close ally, then at least a stable and predictable neighbor." Clara turned the name over carefully, searching her memory for any connection to her father's old records, though nothing immediately surfaced. Still, the possibility that Ravenspire's own neighbor might be secretly connected to the Falcon's network, potentially even serving as the Falcon himself, represented a discovery neither of them could afford to treat carelessly. If Calloway is involved, Clara said slowly, revealing our suspicion too soon could prove disastrous. He would simply deny everything, destroy whatever evidence exists, and prepare his own defenses before we have gathered enough proof to act. Agreed, Gareth said, turning to face her fully, which means we must proceed carefully, gathering proof before confronting him directly. And it means, Clara Bennett, that I require someone I can trust completely to help me build that proof. Someone whose skills extend well beyond simply cataloging old correspondence. Clara met his gaze steadily, recognizing the unspoken question contained within his words. He was asking her, finally and directly, to reveal exactly how far her abilities truly extended, and whether she was prepared to place those abilities fully in service of Ravenspire's survival, rather than simply her own private search for answers. Clara considered her answer carefully, aware that whatever she said next would fundamentally change the nature of her position within Ravenspire, moving her from a useful but expendable servant into something far more significant and far more exposed to danger should her true history ever reach the Falcon's network directly. My father did not simply serve a lord who fell from favor, she said finally, choosing to trust Gareth with the full truth rather than continuing to parcel it out in careful fragments. He was trained as a strategist, someone whose value lay in understanding patterns others could not see, predicting movements before they happened, breaking codes designed specifically to prevent exactly that kind of understanding. He began teaching me these same skills when I was still a child, long before I understood why such knowledge might ever prove necessary. Gareth listened without interrupting, his expression carefully neutral, though something behind his eyes sharpened with each word she spoke. When he disappeared, Clara continued, I told myself the training had been simply a father, passing time with his daughter, nothing more significant than that. It took years before I understood he had been preparing me, perhaps without fully realizing it himself, for exactly the kind of situation I now find myself facing within these walls. You are saying, Gareth said slowly, that your observations regarding the grain shipments, and now this connection to Lord Calloway, were not simply the product of casual attentiveness. No, Clara admitted. They were the product of years of deliberate training, the same training that allows me to look at fragmented, incomplete information and recognize the larger pattern hiding within it, before anyone else notices it exists. Gareth studied her for a long moment, and Clara watched something shift within his expression, calculation giving way slowly to something that looked almost like relief, as though he had finally found confirmation for a suspicion he had carried since their very first meeting in the Great Hall. Then you understand, he said, precisely how valuable, and precisely how dangerous, that skill makes you within a fortress, currently under threat from an enemy who specializes in exactly the kind of careful, patient manipulation you have just described. I understand it completely, Clara said, which is why I am prepared to use it fully, provided you are prepared to trust me with the resources necessary to do so effectively. A faint, genuine smile crossed Gareth's face, for the first time since Clara had arrived at Ravenspire, brief but unmistakable. Very well, Clara Bennett. You will have full access to whatever records, correspondence, and resources you require. Victor will not be pleased by this arrangement, but Victor's approval is not necessary for me to recognize value when it stands directly in front of me. Over the following days, Clara worked with an intensity she had not allowed herself to display since arriving at Ravenspire, no longer bound by the careful restraint of a servant merely cataloging records, but operating openly now as an advisor tasked with uncovering the truth behind Lord Calloway's potential involvement in the Falcon's network. She cross-referenced years of correspondence between Ravenspire and Calloway's territory, searching for any pattern that might reveal hidden communication beneath the surface of routine diplomatic exchange. Victor Kane's suspicion, rather than softening, seemed to sharpen further as Clara's role within the fortress expanded. He watched her with increasing wariness during council meetings, questioning her conclusions more directly, challenging her methods in ways that occasionally bordered on outright hostility. The king has given you remarkable freedom for someone who arrived here as tribute mere weeks ago, Victor said one evening, finding her deep in correspondence within the archive wing. The king has given me the freedom to help protect this fortress, Clara replied evenly. If that troubles you, perhaps the concern would be better directed toward whoever is actually working to destroy it. rather than toward the person trying to stop them. Victor's expression tightened, though he said nothing further, simply turning and leaving her once again to her work. Clara understood his hostility stemmed from genuine concern for Ravenspire's security, rather than simple jealousy or spite, and she respected that concern, even as it complicated her own position within the fortress's increasingly fractured council. Her efforts eventually produced a breakthrough nearly a week later, buried within a routine diplomatic letter exchanged between Gareth and Lord Calloway, nearly 2 years earlier. The letter itself appeared entirely ordinary, discussing trade agreements and shared border patrols, but Clara noticed something peculiar about certain phrases scattered throughout the text, oddly specific word choices that seemed to serve no clear diplomatic purpose. Comparing the phrasing against her father's coded fragment, she realized with sudden, cold clarity that the letter contained a hidden cipher embedded within its ordinary diplomatic language, the same style of code her father had used in his own private correspondence years before. She brought her discovery immediately to Gareth, decoding the hidden message carefully in his presence within the private study where they had first discussed Lord Calloway's potential involvement. "It's an instruction," Clara said, her voice tight with the significance of what she had uncovered. Coded within an otherwise ordinary letter, instructing an unnamed recipient to continue weakening Ravenspire's defenses through whatever means proved most effective, promising further reward for successful disruption. Gareth's expression turned to stone as the implication settled fully over him. "Calloway sent this letter personally," he said, "which means either he wrote this hidden instruction himself, or someone within his household inserted it without his knowledge. Either possibility requires immediate investigation," Clara said. "But if Calloway himself is the Falcon, or working directly for him, then Ravenspire faces a threat far more immediate and dangerous than sabotage through supply shipments and recruited agents like Nathaniel Hale." Gareth turned toward the window, staring out into the darkness beyond the fortress walls, his jaw tight with barely controlled anger. "If Calloway believes his involvement remains hidden," he said slowly, "he may grow bolder, may escalate beyond simple sabotage into something far more direct. We cannot afford to wait passively while gathering additional proof." "Then we do not wait," Clara said. "We prepare for whatever comes next, and we ensure that when it arrives, Ravenspire is ready, rather than caught unprepared, as it nearly was with the grain shipments." Gareth turned back to face her, something resolute settling into his expression. "Tomorrow I will call together my most trusted officers, fully, without holding anything back. You will present everything you have discovered, Clara Bennett, not as a servant offering occasional useful observations, but as the strategist your father trained you to become." Clara felt the weight of the moment settle over her, aware that tomorrow would mark the true unveiling of everything she had kept carefully hidden since her arrival at Ravenspire. There would be no more careful half-truths, no more measured caution, designed to avoid drawing too much attention. Whatever happened next, the full truth of who she was, and what she was capable of, would finally be revealed before the entire Fortress Council, including those, like Victor Kane, who remained deeply uncertain whether that truth represented salvation or danger for the walls they had all sworn to protect. The council chamber was full the following morning. Every senior officer of Ravenspire gathered around the long table, their expressions ranging from cautious curiosity to open skepticism as Clara entered alongside Gareth. Victor Kane stood near his usual position by the window, arms crossed, his gaze fixed on Clara, with an intensity that made the weight of the coming presentation feel even heavier than she had anticipated. Before Clara could begin, however, the chamber door burst open, and a breathless soldier rushed inside, his face pale with urgency. "Riders approaching from the eastern road," he said, struggling to catch his breath. "A significant force, moving fast, banners bearing Calloway's colors." The room erupted into immediate motion, officers rising from their seats, hands moving instinctively toward weapons. Gareth's expression hardened into something cold and focused. "How many riders?" "Scouts estimate at least 200, the soldier said, "perhaps more, concealed within the tree line." 200 riders represented far more than a simple diplomatic escort, and everyone in the room understood immediately what such a force moving toward Ravenspire, without prior warning, truly meant. Whatever Calloway's involvement with the Falcons network, he had apparently decided the time for careful, hidden sabotage had passed. choosing instead to move directly and openly against the fortress before his suspected involvement could be fully exposed. "They mean to strike before we can gather proof against them," Clara said, her mind racing through the implications with the same rapid clarity that had allowed her to notice the pattern in the grain shipments weeks before. "If Calloway believes we suspect him, waiting only increases the risk that his involvement becomes fully exposed. A direct assault, quick and overwhelming, eliminates that risk entirely. We do not have 200 soldiers currently garrisoned within these walls," one of the older officers said, his voice tight with barely controlled alarm. "Our numbers were already stretched thin, managing the grain shortage, and increased patrols following Nathaniel's exposure." Gareth turned toward the map spread across the council table, studying the terrain surrounding Ravenspire with focused intensity. "We have perhaps 2 hours before they reach the outer walls. Less if they push their horses harder than scouts currently estimate. We need every advantage available to us, and we need it immediately." Clara stepped forward, studying the map alongside him, her mind already working through the terrain, the fortress's defensive structure, and everything she had learned about Calloway's likely strategy based on the pattern of careful, patient manipulation that had characterized his approach since Nathaniel's initial recruitment years earlier. "He will not simply charge the main gate," Clara said, tracing her finger along the map's depiction of the surrounding hills. "A man who has spent years operating through careful, hidden manipulation will not suddenly abandon strategy for brute force alone. There will be a diversion, something to draw our attention and defenses toward one point, while the true assault comes from another direction entirely." Victor Kane stepped closer to the table, his earlier hostility momentarily set aside in the face of the immediate crisis. "You believe this force approaching from the eastern road is not the true threat?" "I believe it is intended to appear as though it is," Clara said. "Recall the narrow pass we traveled through on the journey here from Millhaven, the terrain that made your own soldiers nervous even during a routine transport. If Calloway's forces know this fortress well, and given his years of diplomatic correspondence with Ravenspire, he likely does, they would recognize that same pass as an ideal location for a smaller, more decisive force to move unseen, while our attention remains fixed on the larger, more visible approach." Gareth studied the map with sharpened focus, following the path Clara indicated toward the narrow pass, roughly 2 miles south of the main eastern road. "If you're right, a smaller force moving through that pass could reach the fortress's southern wall, the weakest point in our current defenses, while every soldier we have is positioned to repel the larger force approaching from the east. It would explain why 200 riders would announce themselves so openly," Clara said. "Not because Calloway intends genuine victory through direct assault, but because he intends to occupy our attention completely, while the true blow lands somewhere we are not prepared to defend." The council chamber fell silent as officers absorbed the implications of Clara's analysis, several exchanging uncertain glances, clearly torn between skepticism toward a theory built entirely from pattern and inference, and growing recognition that every prediction Clara had made since her arrival at Ravenspire had ultimately proven correct. "We cannot risk ignoring the possibility," Gareth said finally, his decision made. "Roland, take half our available soldiers to reinforce the southern wall immediately, quietly, without revealing our awareness of the potential threat to anyone watching from beyond the walls. The remaining forces will position along the eastern approach, prepared to repel the visible force, but instructed to hold position rather than pursuing aggressively, should the riders attempt to draw them further from the fortress." Roland nodded sharply and moved immediately to carry out the order, several officers following close behind him, already shouting instructions to gather soldiers and prepare the southern defenses. Victor lingered a moment longer, studying Clara with an expression that had shifted subtly from suspicion into something closer to reluctant respect. "If you are wrong about this," he said quietly, "we will have split our forces unnecessarily at the worst possible moment." "If I am right," Clara replied evenly, "splitting our forces is the only strategy that prevents Ravenspire from falling entirely." Victor held her gaze a moment longer, before finally nodding once and departing to oversee preparations along the eastern wall himself. Gareth remained beside Clara, watching the chamber empty as officers rushed to execute the hurried defensive plan she had just outlined. "You realize," he said quietly, once they were finally alone, "that if this theory proves incorrect, the consequences will fall upon both of us equally." My officers already trust your judgment far more than they trust mine at this particular moment. I am aware, Clara said, meeting his gaze steadily, which is precisely why I would not have proposed this strategy unless I believed it with complete certainty. Gareth studied her for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them, respect mixed with genuine concern for what the coming hours might bring. Then let us hope, Clara Bennett, that your father trained you as thoroughly as you claim. Together, they made their way toward the fortress walls, Clara's mind already racing ahead toward the confrontation she suspected was coming, aware that within the next 2 hours, her carefully constructed theory would either save Ravenspire from a devastating surprise attack, or expose both herself and Gareth to consequences neither of them could fully predict. From the eastern wall, Clara watched the approaching force grow visible against the horizon, banners bearing Calloway's colors snapping in the wind, as riders drew closer across the open fields surrounding Ravenspire. Soldiers lined the battlements around her, tension radiating through the fortress with a palpable weight, every eye fixed on the approaching threat, while, unseen by anyone beyond the walls, Roland led half their remaining forces quietly toward the southern defenses, moving through inner passageways designed to avoid detection from outside observation. The riders slowed as they approached within arrow range, forming a loose formation across the field, rather than immediately charging the gate. A single rider broke from the group, moving forward under a flag of parley, and Gareth, standing beside Clara atop the wall, studied the approaching figure with narrowed eyes. "That is Calloway himself," he said quietly. He would not risk his own presence unless he believed the outcome already decided. The rider halted a safe distance from the walls, his voice carrying clearly across the field as he called up toward the fortress. "Gareth Voss. I come offering terms, rather than immediate conflict. Surrender the fortress peacefully, and I promise mercy for those within its walls." "Terms," Gareth called back, his voice carrying easily despite the distance. "From a man who has spent months secretly sabotaging my supply chains and recruiting agents within my own household? I find your sudden interest in mercy somewhat difficult to trust, Lord Calloway." A flicker of surprise crossed the distant rider's face, quickly masked, though not quickly enough to escape Clara's careful observation from her position beside Gareth. "I do not know what accusations you have been fed," Calloway called back, "but I assure you, they are baseless. I come only seeking to resolve tensions between our territories before they escalate into unnecessary conflict." "Then perhaps you can explain," Gareth said, "why 200 riders were required to deliver such a peaceful message." Calloway's expression hardened, the pretense of diplomatic concern finally slipping away entirely. "Very well, Voss. If you insist on conflict rather than reasonable surrender, do not claim afterward that I failed to offer you every opportunity to avoid it." He wheeled his horse back toward his assembled forces, and moments later, the entire formation surged forward toward the fortress walls, the sudden roar of charging riders and shouted commands filling the air with chaotic urgency. Soldiers along the eastern wall braced themselves, arrows nocked, ready to repel the assault, though Clara noticed something that confirmed every suspicion she had voiced within the council chamber only hours before. The charge, despite its overwhelming visual intensity, remained curiously restrained, riders pulling back, just beyond effective arrow range, rather than pressing forward into a full assault against the fortress gate. It was theater, Clara realized immediately, designed to hold the fortress's attention completely, while the true threat moved unseen elsewhere. "The southern wall," she said urgently, turning to Gareth. "This is exactly the diversion we anticipated. We need confirmation immediately." Gareth nodded sharply, dispatching a runner to check on Roland's position at the southern defenses, even as the eastern assault continued its strange, hesitant rhythm below them. Riders advancing and retreating in coordinated waves that inflicted minimal actual damage while consuming the fortress's full defensive attention. The runner returned within minutes, breathless but bearing exactly the confirmation Clara had feared. A force of perhaps 50 riders emerged from the southern pass, just as predicted, the runner reported. Roland's men were positioned and ready. The attempted assault has been repelled, though fighting continues at the southern wall. Relief and vindication mixed uneasily within Clara's chest as she absorbed the news. Her theory had proven correct. The southern defenses had held precisely because Roland's forces had been positioned in advance, and Calloway's carefully planned surprise had ultimately failed to achieve its intended element of shock. "Order the eastern gate to hold position," Gareth commanded, his voice carrying renewed confidence. "Do not pursue the retreating force. Let Calloway realize his diversion has failed before he commits further resources to a battle he can no longer win through surprise alone." Word spread quickly among the soldiers along the eastern wall, and within moments, the visible relief among the ranks became palpable. Arrows still nocked and ready, but postures shifting from desperate defense into something closer to controlled, confident readiness. Below them, Calloway's forces, apparently receiving similar word from their own southern contingent, began a slow, hesitant retreat, riders pulling back toward the tree line, with visible confusion rippling through their ranks. Calloway himself remained visible near the front of his retreating forces, his expression, even at a distance, betraying the particular fury of a man watching a carefully constructed plan collapse entirely. He turned his horse briefly back toward the fortress, and though his words could not carry clearly across the increasing distance, his posture conveyed a promise of future retaliation more clearly than any shouted threat could have managed. As the last of Calloway's forces disappeared beyond the tree line, a cheer rose slowly among the soldiers atop Ravenspire's walls, exhausted relief finally breaking through the tense discipline that had held throughout the confrontation. Gareth turned toward Clara, something in his expression that mixed genuine gratitude with renewed, sharpened respect. "You saved this fortress today," he said quietly, away from the celebrating soldiers around them. "Your theory, your understanding of Calloway's likely strategy, prevented what could easily have become a devastating defeat." "We saved this fortress," Clara corrected gently. "I provided a theory. You and your soldiers provided the courage and discipline necessary to act upon it correctly." Gareth studied her for a long moment, the noise of celebrating soldiers fading into background static as something unspoken settled between them, an understanding built through shared crisis that neither entirely trusted words to properly capture. "Whatever remains hidden about your true purpose in coming here, Clara Bennett," he said finally, "I no longer question whether your presence within these walls serves Ravenspire's interest. Today, you prove that beyond any reasonable doubt." Clara held his gaze, aware that the true purpose behind her arrival at Ravenspire remained only partially resolved. Calloway's involvement confirmed, but the Falcon's true identity still hidden beyond her reach. Yet standing atop the fortress walls, watching soldiers celebrate a victory achieved through careful strategy, rather than blind luck, she felt something shift within herself as well, a growing sense that her fate, and Ravenspire's fate, had become far more deeply intertwined than she had ever originally intended. In the days following the failed attack, Ravenspire settled into a strange new rhythm, wounds tended, defenses reinforced, and word of Clara's role in predicting Calloway's strategy spreading quickly through every corner of the household. Servants who had once regarded her with polite indifference now watched her with open curiosity, some with admiration, others with the same wary uncertainty Victor Kane had displayed since her earliest days in the archive wing. Victor himself sought her out privately, finding her in the archive on a quiet afternoon, his expression carrying none of its earlier hostility, though something more complicated had replaced it. "I owe you an apology," he said, standing somewhat stiffly near the entrance. "My suspicion toward you was not entirely unwarranted given the circumstances, but I allowed that suspicion to blind me toward the possibility that your presence here might genuinely serve Ravenspire's interests, rather than threaten them. Your suspicion protected this fortress, as much as my observations did," Clara said. "A council too willing to trust every new arrival without question would be far easier for someone like Calloway to manipulate." Victor studied her for a moment, something shifting in his expression that looked almost like genuine respect. "Perhaps," he said. "Still, I find myself curious now, about a question I have not yet asked directly. What do you intend to do, now that your original purpose in coming here has been at least partially fulfilled?" Clara considered the question carefully, aware that the answer had grown more complicated than she anticipated when she first volunteered herself as tribute back in Millhaven. "Calloway's involvement confirms my father's death was connected to something larger than simple bad fortune," she said. "But the Falcon's true identity remains hidden. Until I understand that fully, I do not believe my purpose here is finished." "And afterward?" Victor pressed. "Once the Falcon's identity is finally uncovered, what then?" It was a question Clara had not yet allowed herself to consider fully, distracted as she had been by the immediate crises unfolding one after another since her arrival. She said nothing, and Victor, apparently satisfied that his point had been made regardless of any direct answer, nodded once and departed, leaving Clara alone with thoughts she had been carefully avoiding. That evening, Gareth summoned her once again to the private study, where they had first discussed Calloway's suspected involvement, though this time, the atmosphere between them carried a different quality entirely, less formal, more genuinely personal than any of their previous interactions had allowed. Calloway will not simply accept this defeat quietly, Gareth said, pacing slowly near the window as Clara entered. He has revealed his hand now, openly attacking Ravenspire, rather than working solely through hidden sabotage. Whatever comes next, I suspect it will be more direct and more dangerous. Agreed, Clara said, though his open attack also means he can no longer hide behind diplomatic pretense. Other regional lords will eventually learn of his aggression, and that knowledge may prove useful in isolating him politically, even if military conflict continues. Gareth nodded, though his expression remained troubled by something beyond simple strategic concern. I have been considering, he said slowly, the circumstances of your arrival here. You were traded to me as tribute, a debt paid by a struggling village, desperate to avoid harsher consequences. Yet you have proven yourself invaluable to this fortress's survival, far beyond anything a simple hostage could ever offer. Circumstances change, Clara said carefully, uncertain where his words were leading. They do, Gareth agreed. Which raises the question of what your circumstances should become now, moving forward. You did not come here seeking a permanent place within my household. You came seeking answers about your father. But those answers, and the threats connected to them, have become entangled with Ravenspire's own survival, in ways neither of us anticipated. Clara studied him carefully, recognizing the careful, deliberate weight behind his words. A man accustomed to measuring every statement before speaking it aloud, now clearly working towards something he had not yet fully articulated even to himself. What are you asking me, Gareth? He turned to face her fully, his expression unusually open for a man who had spent their entire acquaintance carefully guarding every visible emotion. I am asking whether you wish to remain here, not as tribute, not as a servant fulfilling a debt, but as something closer to what you have already proven yourself capable of being, an advisor, whose counsel this fortress genuinely needs, for as long as threats like Calloway and the Falcon's hidden network continue to circle these walls. The offer settled over Clara with unexpected weight, considerations she had not fully allowed herself to examine suddenly demanding attention. She had come to Ravenspire believing her time here would be temporary, a means toward uncovering her father's fate, before eventually returning to whatever remained of her life in Millhaven, or moving onward toward wherever the full truth ultimately led her. She had not anticipated the fortress itself, and the man now standing before her, becoming something she genuinely cared about protecting, independent of her original, more selfish motivations. I would need to continue searching for the Falcon's true identity, she said finally, choosing honesty over careful diplomatic evasion. That search will not simply end, because Calloway's involvement has been exposed. I would expect nothing less, Gareth said, and I would offer every resource within my power to assist that search, provided you are willing to remain here as something more than a temporary guest passing through towards some eventual departure. Clara held his gaze steadily, aware that whatever answer she gave now would shape not only her own future, but her relationship with a man who had begun their acquaintance as a captor demanding tribute, and had somehow, through weeks of shared crisis and careful mutual respect, become something far more complicated than either of them had initially expected. Then I accept, she said finally, not out of obligation, and not simply because circumstances have entangled my search with Ravenspire's survival, but because I have come to believe this fortress, and the people within it, deserve someone willing to fight for their protection, as fiercely as I intend to fight for answers about my father. Something genuine and unguarded crossed Gareth's expression at her answer, relief mixed with something warmer, something neither of them yet felt prepared to name directly. Then Ravenspire is fortunate, he said quietly, to have earned your loyalty through such difficult circumstances. Ravenspire earned nothing, Clara replied, a faint smile finally breaking through her own careful composure. You earned it, Gareth Voss. Through every choice you made, trusting my judgment, when trusting me, could easily have proven a costly mistake. Outside the study window, the fortress settled into evening quiet, torches burning steadily against the gathering darkness, soldiers patrolling walls that had held firm against Calloway's carefully planned assault. Somewhere beyond those walls, Clara knew, greater dangers still waited, the Falcon's true identity still hidden, Calloway's wounded pride certain to seek renewed conflict rather than peaceful resolution. But for the first time since arriving at Ravenspire as unwilling tribute, Clara felt something closer to genuine purpose settling over her, a sense that whatever challenges remained ahead, she would face them not as an outsider searching desperately for answers, but as someone who had finally found a place, and people, worth fighting for. The following morning brought a task Clara had been putting off since the immediate crisis of Calloway's attack had consumed her full attention. With Gareth's permission, she requested access to records predating even the oldest archives Lucy had shown her during her first days at Ravenspire, documents stored in a sealed section, reserved for matters of the fortress's earliest history under previous rulers. Victor accompanied her personally to unlock the chamber, his manner far more cooperative now than it had been during their earlier interactions. "These records have not been reviewed in years," he said, gesturing toward shelves thick with dust and neglect. "If you believe something relevant to your father's history exists here, I confess I have no immediate knowledge of where to begin looking." "Neither do I, entirely," Clara admitted. "But my father's coded fragment references a debt owed by someone in significant authority. If that debt connects to events that occurred before Ravenspire fell under Gareth's rule, these older records may hold information no one has thought to examine in decades." They worked together through the afternoon, Victor's careful, methodical approach complementing Clara's instinct for pattern recognition in ways that made the tedious search considerably more efficient than either might have managed alone. It was well past midday when Clara finally uncovered something of genuine significance, a ledger recording payments made to various individuals during the final years of the previous ruling family's control over Ravenspire, before Gareth had claimed the fortress through means Clara still did not fully understand. One entry, dated nearly 2 decades earlier, recorded a substantial payment made to an unnamed party for services described only as resolution of the Ashford matter, authorized by someone whose signature had been deliberately smudged beyond legibility. Ashford, Clara murmured, the name tugging at something buried deep in her memory. She had heard it before, she realized slowly, spoken briefly by her father many years ago, in a conversation she had been too young at the time to fully understand or remember clearly. Lord Ashford governed a territory bordering both Ravenspire and Calloway's lands before his fall from power, Victor said, studying the entry alongside her. His household was dissolved suddenly, decades ago, the circumstances always remaining somewhat unclear even to those of us who served the fortress during that period. Clara felt the pieces finally beginning to align into something resembling clarity. Her father, she now suspected, had served within Lord Ashford's household before its dissolution, likely as part of whatever strategic or advisory role his training had prepared him for. Whatever secret led to Ashford's fall from power had evidently required resolution, a euphemism, Clara suspected, for something far darker than diplomatic reassignment. "If my father was present during Ashford's fall," she said slowly, "and if the Falcon was responsible for whatever resolution this payment describes, then the connection between Calloway, my father's disappearance, and this fortress runs back decades rather than simply the recent months of sabotage we have been investigating." Victor studied the ledger entry with renewed intensity. This predates Gareth's rule considerably. Whoever authorized this payment held significant power within this region long before the current arrangement of territories and alliances took shape. The implications settled heavily over Clara as she considered the full scope of what she had uncovered. The Falcon's network, it seemed, had operated far longer and with far deeper roots than she had initially suspected, connected not simply to recent tensions between Ravenspire and Calloway's territory, but to a pattern of manipulation and silencing that stretched back through decades of regional history. "We need to bring this to Gareth immediately," Clara said, carefully folding the ledger entry to preserve it for further examination. "If the Falcon's network has operated this long, hidden this deeply within regional politics, then whoever currently bears that title may hold far more influence and protection than we initially assumed." Victor nodded, though his expression carried genuine concern rather than simple agreement. "Be cautious, Clara. If this network has survived and operated successfully for decades without exposure, Those responsible have clearly developed considerable skill at eliminating threats to their continued secrecy. Your father discovered too much, and paid for that discovery with his freedom, if not his life. I would not wish to see you pay a similar price." Clara appreciated the genuine concern behind Victor's words, a marked shift from the suspicious hostility that had characterized their earliest interactions. "I intend to be careful, but I did not come this far, uncovering years of hidden truth, only to stop now, simply because the danger has grown clearer." That evening, as she presented her discovery to Gareth within the privacy of his study, his expression grew increasingly grave with each new detail she revealed about Lord Ashford's fall, and the decades-old payment connected to the Falcon's earliest known activities. "This changes the scope of everything we are facing," he said finally, once Clara had finished her account. "If this network has operated successfully for this long, protected by whoever currently controls it, then Calloway may be merely one piece within a far larger and more dangerous structure than we initially understood. Which means uncovering the Falcon's true identity has become more urgent than ever," Clara said. "Not simply for my own sake, in understanding my father's fate, but for Ravenspire's continued survival against a threat far more entrenched than we originally realized." Gareth studied her for a long moment, something resolute settling into his expression. "Then we pursue this together, fully, regardless of where the truth eventually leads us. Whatever powerful figures may be protecting themselves through decades of careful manipulation, they have not yet encountered someone with your particular skill, for uncovering exactly the patterns they have worked so hard to keep hidden." Clara nodded, feeling the weight of the coming challenge settle over her, alongside a renewed sense of determination. Whatever remained hidden about the Falcon's true identity, whatever dangers still waited in the shadows surrounding Ravenspire, she intended to uncover them fully, regardless of the cost. 2 weeks passed with deceptive calm settling over Ravenspire, though Clara used every available moment, continuing her investigation into the Falcon's decades-old network, cross-referencing the Ashford ledger against every scrap of correspondence she could locate, connecting the fortress's history to the surrounding territories. Gareth, meanwhile, worked to strengthen alliances with neighboring lords, quietly sharing evidence of Calloway's aggression, in hopes of isolating him politically, before further conflict became necessary. The calm ended abruptly one evening, when a rider arrived at Ravenspire's gates, exhausted, and bearing urgent news from a scout Gareth had positioned along the border with Calloway's territory. Clara was summoned immediately to the council chamber, where she found Gareth already studying a hastily drawn map, his expression tense with barely contained urgency. "Calloway is moving his full military strength toward our border," Gareth said without preamble as Clara entered. "Not the limited force he sent before, but nearly his entire standing army, supplemented by mercenaries recruited from beyond his own territory. He means to finish what the earlier attack failed to accomplish," Clara said, studying the map carefully. "A full assault rather than a divided strategy relying on surprise. My scouts estimate he will reach Ravenspire within 3 days," Gareth said. "We do not currently have sufficient forces to repel an assault of this scale, through defense alone." Clara studied the map with focused intensity, her mind racing through possibilities, considering not simply the immediate military challenge, but the broader political landscape surrounding the coming conflict. "You mentioned reaching out to neighboring lords regarding Calloway's earlier aggression. Has any of them offered support?" "Several have expressed sympathy," Gareth said, frustration evident in his voice. "None have committed forces directly. Most prefer to wait and observe how this conflict unfolds, before risking their own soldiers in a fight that is not yet clearly theirs to join." Clara considered this carefully, an idea forming slowly as she cross-referenced the political relationships she had studied over recent weeks, against the deeper history she had uncovered regarding the Falcon's network. What if we could prove, publicly and undeniably, that Calloway's aggression stems not from a legitimate territorial dispute, but from his involvement in a hidden criminal network, responsible for manipulation and violence across the entire region for decades? Gareth's eyes sharpened with sudden interest. "You believe you can produce such proof before his forces arrive?" "I believe I can produce enough to convince at least some of the neighboring lords that supporting Ravenspire serves their own interests, rather than simply remaining neutral in what they currently view as an isolated conflict," Clara said. "The Ashford ledger, combined with Nathaniel's confession and the coded correspondence we discovered, may be enough to demonstrate a pattern too significant for cautious neighbors to continue ignoring. Over the following 2 days, Clara worked with relentless focus, compiling every piece of evidence into a clear, carefully organized presentation designed to demonstrate the Falcon's decades-long pattern of manipulation across the region, while Gareth personally rode to meet with the 2 neighboring lords whose territories bordered both Ravenspire and Calloway's lands most directly. Victor accompanied Clara's efforts within the fortress, helping verify each piece of evidence against additional records uncovered during their earlier search through the sealed archive chamber. The results arrived just as Calloway's forces crossed into visible range of Ravenspire's border scouts, word reaching the fortress that one of the 2 neighboring lords, convinced by the evidence Gareth had presented, agreed to send reinforcements immediately, while the second remained cautiously uncommitted, though clearly shaken by the implications of what Clara's research had revealed. The reinforcements arrived just hours before Calloway's forces reached the fortress's outer defenses, nearly 300 additional soldiers, bolstering Ravenspire's previously insufficient numbers, enough to shift the balance of the coming confrontation from near-certain defeat into something closer to genuine possibility of successful defense. As Calloway's massive force finally came into view along the eastern approach, banners stretching across the horizon in overwhelming numbers, Clara stood once again atop the fortress walls beside Gareth, watching the culmination of weeks of careful investigation and political maneuvering finally reach its decisive moment. "Whatever happens today," Gareth said quietly, watching the approaching army, "you have already given Ravenspire something Calloway did not anticipate when he began this campaign: allies, evidence, and enough warning to prepare, rather than face this assault unprepared, as we nearly did before." "It may not be enough," Clara said honestly, studying the sheer scale of the force arrayed against them. "It may not be," Gareth agreed, "but it is considerably more than we would have had without you." The battle that followed unfolded with brutal intensity, Calloway's forces pressing hard against Ravenspire's reinforced defenses throughout the day, while Clara worked alongside Gareth's officers coordinating the fortress's response with the same careful, pattern-focused strategy that had proven successful during the earlier, smaller assault. She identified weaknesses in Calloway's formation as they emerged, suggested tactical adjustments that allowed Ravenspire's defenders to concentrate their strength at critical moments, and maintained the kind of clear, focused thinking under pressure that steadied the officers around her, even as the fighting grew increasingly desperate. By late afternoon, with losses mounting on both sides, and the outcome still genuinely uncertain, a final development shifted the battle decisively. The second neighboring lord, apparently convinced by the sight of open conflict combined with the evidence Gareth had shared days earlier, arrived with his own forces, striking Calloway's exposed flank with the kind of surprise that mirrored, almost precisely, the diversionary strategy Calloway himself had attempted weeks before. Caught between Ravenspire's reinforced defenses and an unexpected assault from his own flank, Calloway's forces began a rapid, disorganized retreat, the carefully planned assault collapsing into chaos as soldiers fled, rather than face annihilation between 2 converging forces. Calloway himself was captured during the retreat, dragged before Gareth in chains as evening finally settled over the exhausted, blood-soaked fields surrounding Ravenspire. "You have lost," Gareth said simply, studying the man who had spent months working to destroy everything Ravenspire represented. "Your network is exposed, your forces defeated, and your allies among the neighboring territories will soon understand precisely what kind of man they briefly considered supporting." Calloway's expression carried none of the fury Clara had expected, instead settling into something closer to resigned, bitter acceptance. "You believe capturing me ends this," he said quietly. "You believe the Falcon's network dies with my exposure. Does it not?" Clara asked, stepping forward. Calloway's laugh carried genuine, exhausted despair, echoing the same bitter tone Nathaniel had displayed weeks earlier, during his own confession. "I am not the Falcon," he said. "I never claimed to be. I served him, the same as everyone else caught within his network, recruited through debts and secrets I could not afford to have exposed. The Falcon remains exactly where he has always been, hidden, protected, untouched by whatever consequences fall upon those of us unfortunate enough to serve his purposes directly." The revelation settled over Clara with cold, unwelcome clarity. Calloway's defeat, however significant, had not truly ended the threat that had haunted her family for years. Somewhere, still hidden, still protected. The true architect of decades of manipulation and violence remained entirely untouched by everything that had unfolded at Ravenspire. "Then tell us who he is," Gareth demanded, stepping closer to the captured lord. "You have lost everything already. What further loyalty could you possibly owe him now?" Calloway's eyes shifted toward Clara, something unreadable passing across his exhausted expression. "The Falcon does not simply punish disloyalty," he said quietly. "He ensures that anyone who speaks his true name suffers consequences, reaching far beyond themselves alone. I have already lost my territory, my forces, my freedom. I will not risk what remains of my family's safety by speaking a name that has silenced far more powerful men than myself." Clara studied him carefully, recognizing the genuine fear underlying his refusal, fear that no threat of continued imprisonment or consequence seemed capable of overriding. Whatever protection surrounded the Falcon's true identity, it clearly ran deeper and more dangerous than simple political influence alone. That night, as Calloway remained under close guard within Ravenspire's lower chambers, Clara returned once more to her father's coded fragment, studying it alongside the newly gathered evidence from the Ashford ledger and Nathaniel's earlier confession. Something about Calloway's fear, his insistence that the Falcon had silenced men far more powerful than himself, nagged at her thoughts with growing insistence. She thought back through every detail gathered since her arrival at Ravenspire, searching for any connection she might have overlooked. The Falcon's ring, described by Nathaniel as bearing a carved falcon set in dark stone, the euphemistic language used in the decades-old ledger entry regarding Lord Ashford's fall, the careful, patient method of recruitment that had ensnared both her father and Nathaniel through gradually escalating obligations rather than sudden, obvious coercion. A thought occurred to her slowly, uncomfortable and unwelcome, though she could not immediately dismiss it. Gareth himself had recognized the ring when Nathaniel first described it, recalling a merchant who had delivered correspondence on Calloway's behalf at a gathering of regional lords years earlier. But what if that memory represented something more significant than a simple, isolated encounter? Clara pushed the thought aside, almost as quickly as it arose, uncomfortable with the direction her suspicion had briefly wandered. Gareth had trusted her completely, had risked his own counsel's confidence supporting her theories, had fought alongside her against Calloway's forces, with genuine, evident commitment to Ravenspire's protection. Suspecting him now, based on nothing more than a single recalled memory of a ring seen years earlier, felt like a betrayal of trust that had been earned through weeks of shared crisis and mutual respect. Yet the discipline her father had instilled in her since childhood would not allow her to dismiss any possibility, however uncomfortable, without proper examination. The Falcon's network had operated for decades, protected by careful manipulation and the silence of those too frightened or too compromised to speak against him. Someone in a position of significant regional authority had authorized the payment described in the Ashford ledger. Gareth himself had only recently claimed control over Ravenspire, but the fortress's history extended back decades, and Clara realized she had never fully investigated the circumstances under which Gareth had come to power in the first place. She spent the following morning quietly reviewing records of Ravenspire's transition from the previous ruling family to Gareth's current authority, careful to avoid drawing attention to her search, aware that if her suspicion proved unfounded, raising it carelessly could damage irreparably the trust that had grown between them since her arrival. The records revealed a transition that appeared, on the surface, entirely legitimate, Gareth having earned his position through military service and eventual succession following the previous ruler's death from natural causes rather than any suspicious circumstance. Relief settled over her as she confirmed the straightforward nature of Gareth's rise to power, though the underlying question remained unresolved. If Gareth was not connected to the Falcon's network, someone else within the region's complex web of authority and alliance still bore that dangerous title, someone powerful enough to have silenced her father decades ago and to have recruited both Calloway and Nathaniel into service through the same patient, coercive methods. She brought her concerns to Gareth that afternoon, choosing honesty over continued private suspicion, aware that whatever trust existed between them deserved transparency rather than silent doubt. "I considered, briefly, whether you might be connected to the Falcon's network," she admitted, watching his reaction carefully as she spoke. "Given your recognition of the ring, and the fortress's long history predating your rule. To her relief, Gareth did not react with anger or offense, instead studying her with something closer to understanding. A reasonable suspicion, given everything we have uncovered, he said. I would have been more concerned if you had not at least considered the possibility, given how thoroughly you have learned to question every assumption during your time here. I have confirmed your rise to power occurred through legitimate means, Clara said. But that leaves us still searching for someone whose authority and influence within this region run deep enough to have protected the Falcons network for decades. Gareth considered this carefully, something shifting behind his expression as a new thought seemed to occur to him. There is one figure I have not yet fully considered, he said slowly. Someone whose influence spans the entire region, respected and trusted by nearly every territory, including my own. Someone whose position would provide exactly the kind of protection necessary to shield a network as extensive as the one we have uncovered. Who? Clara asked, her pulse quickening. The regional magistrate, Gareth said. The figure responsible for mediating disputes between territories, overseeing trade agreements, and maintaining whatever fragile peace exists between lords, who might otherwise fall into constant conflict. A position of tremendous influence, precisely because it appears neutral, trusted equally by every party, above the kind of suspicion we have directed toward Calloway. Clara felt the pieces of years of searching finally beginning to align into something resembling a complete and dangerous picture. A figure trusted by everyone, positioned precisely to observe and manipulate tensions between territories, powerful enough to authorize decades-old payments for the silencing of inconvenient men like her father, and protected by exactly the kind of neutral reputation that would prevent anyone from suspecting his true nature. We need proof, she said, her mind already racing ahead toward the careful, methodical investigation such an accusation would require. Proof strong enough to expose someone whose position has protected him from suspicion for decades. Gareth nodded, his expression resolute, despite the daunting scale of the challenge now facing them. Then we gather it, Clara Bennett, exactly as we have gathered every piece of evidence that brought us this far. Carefully, patiently, and with the same relentless attention to detail that has already exposed threats no one else within this region managed to see clearly, until you arrived to reveal them. The investigation into Magistrate Aldous Fenwick, a man whose reputation for fair, neutral judgment had earned him respect across the entire region for over 2 decades, required a level of caution Clara had not previously needed to exercise. Unlike Calloway, whose aggression had eventually exposed itself through open conflict, Fenwick's position depended entirely on maintaining an unblemished reputation, meaning any premature accusation risked destroying Clara's credibility rather than exposing his guilt. She worked quietly over the following weeks, cross-referencing decades of regional correspondence against every payment, ruling, and mediation Fenwick had ever overseen, searching for the same subtle patterns that had exposed the grain shipment sabotage and Calloway's hidden involvement. Gareth provided access to every resource Ravenspire possessed, while Victor Kane, now fully committed to supporting Clara's investigation, used his own extensive knowledge of regional politics to identify connections she might otherwise have overlooked. The breakthrough came gradually, rather than through any single decisive discovery. Clara noticed that every dispute Fenwick had ever mediated between territories seemed to consistently benefit whichever party had, unknowingly or otherwise, become entangled in obligations to the Falcons network. Lords who resisted or questioned Fenwick's rulings inevitably found themselves facing sudden, unexplained difficulties, financial troubles, damaged reputations, or, in several cases documented across decades of records, complete removal from positions of authority, through circumstances that mirrored precisely the pattern that had claimed her own father years before. He has been managing this entire region's balance of power for decades, Clara explained to Gareth and Victor during a private meeting, once her research had produced sufficient pattern to feel confident in her conclusion. Every dispute he mediates subtly reinforces the Falcons network, rewarding those who cooperate, quietly punishing those who resist. It is precisely the kind of long-term, patient manipulation that would explain how this network has survived undetected for so long. Proving this to other regional lords will be considerably more difficult than exposing Calloway, Victor observed. Fenwick's reputation for fairness runs deep. Many will resist believing accusations against a figure they have trusted for years. Which is precisely why the proof must be undeniable, Clara said, not simply pattern and inference, but direct evidence connecting Fenwick personally to the Falcon's identity. That evidence arrived through an unexpected source nearly a month later. Nathaniel Hale, still held under careful guard within Ravenspire following his earlier confession, requested to speak with Clara directly, claiming to have remembered additional details he had initially withheld out of fear rather than deliberate deception. "I recognize something," Nathaniel said, when Clara met with him in the modest chamber where he remained confined. "Reviewing the details you have gathered about Magistrate Fenwick. Years ago, before my direct recruitment, I once delivered a message on behalf of the merchant who first approached me, a message intended for a recipient I never met directly. But I remember the location where I was instructed to leave it, Fenwick's private estate, hidden within a specific compartment in his personal study, accessible only through a passage few beyond his immediate household would recognize." The detail provided exactly the kind of concrete lead Clara had been searching for, a physical location that might contain direct evidence connecting Fenwick to the Falcon's true identity, rather than simply circumstantial pattern. Gareth authorized a careful, discreet investigation of Fenwick's estate, conducted under the pretense of a routine diplomatic visit to avoid alerting the magistrate to their true purpose. Clara accompanied the mission personally, disguised among Gareth's official delegation, and during a carefully orchestrated moment of distraction, located the hidden compartment Nathaniel had described within Fenwick's private study. Inside, she discovered a collection of correspondence spanning decades, coded messages matching precisely the cipher pattern her father had used in his own fragment, along with a simple ring bearing a falcon carved into dark stone, identical to the description Nathaniel had provided weeks earlier. The evidence, once gathered and presented before a carefully assembled council of regional lords, proved undeniable. Fenwick's decades of careful manipulation, his role in silencing men like Clara's father, his authorization of the payment described in the Ashford ledger, and his ongoing direction of Calloway's aggression against Ravenspire, all connected through evidence too thorough and too specific to dismiss as coincidence or fabrication. Fenwick's fall from power occurred swiftly once the truth became undeniable, his decades of carefully cultivated reputation collapsing entirely as lords who had once trusted his judgment turned unanimously against him. He was stripped of his position and placed under permanent confinement, the Falcon's network finally, fully exposed and dismantled after decades of hidden influence over the region's fragile political balance. In the weeks that followed, as Ravenspire settled into a period of hard-earned peace, Clara found herself standing once again atop the fortress walls, where she had first watched Calloway's forces retreat months earlier, though the weight she carried now felt entirely different from the uncertain, searching burden she had carried upon her arrival. Gareth joined her there, one quiet evening, the sunset casting warm light across walls that had weathered every crisis the Falcon's network had thrown against them. "Your father would be proud," he said quietly, "to see how thoroughly his training served not only your own search for answers, but the protection of an entire region from decades of hidden manipulation." "He would be proud that the truth finally came to light," Clara said, "though I suspect he never imagined his training would lead his daughter into a fortress ruled by a man who first considered her nothing more than tribute owed for an unpaid debt." Gareth's smile carried genuine warmth, a far cry from the guarded, unreadable expression he had shown during their very first meeting. "Circumstances change," he said, echoing words she had once spoken to him. "What began as tribute became something far more significant, an alliance neither of us could have predicted when you first arrived at these walls." Clara turned to face him fully, considering everything that had unfolded since that first horn sounded over Millhaven months earlier. She had come to Ravenspire seeking answers about her father's disappearance, and she had found them, though the truth had proven far more dangerous and far-reaching than she had ever anticipated. She had also found something she had not been searching for at all, a place and a purpose that felt genuinely her own, rather than simply a means toward uncovering the past. "What happens now?" she asked, "with Fenwick exposed and the Falcon's network finally dismantled?" "Now," Gareth said, "Ravenspire begins to rebuild, stronger and more stable than it has been in decades, freed finally from the hidden manipulation that has shaped this region's politics for far too long. And you, Clara Bennett, if you are willing, continue serving as the advisor whose skill and courage made that freedom possible." Clara considered the offer, though she already knew her answer, had known it perhaps, since the moment she chose to volunteer herself as tribute back in Millhaven, driven by a search for truth that had ultimately led her somewhere she never expected to call home. "I am willing," she said simply, watching the sun finally disappear below the distant hills, casting the fortress into the soft, settled darkness of evening. "For as long as Ravenspire needs someone willing to notice the details others overlook, I intend to remain exactly where I am." And so, within the walls of the fortress that had once demanded her as payment for a debt owed by a struggling village, Clara Bennett found not captivity, but purpose, not tribute, but partnership, and not merely the answers she had risked everything to uncover, but a future she had never dared to imagine when the horn first sounded over Millhaven so many months before.